Welcome to Secrets in Slumber. Hello, dear listener. Tonight, we drift into quiet corridors and whispered archives where the Pentagon's secrets meet the calm of twilight. This is not a tale of fear, but of wonder, of mysteries once hidden, now softly spoken. Settle in, breathe deeply, and let the story guide you gently toward rest. At dusk, the Pentagon changes. By day, it is alive with footsteps, the hum of elevators, and the steady rhythm of a building that never truly sleeps. But at twilight, when the sun slips low over Washington, the great five-sided fortress softens into shadow. Its windows catch the fading light, glowing briefly before night settles. The corridors grow quieter. The shuffle of papers, the muted tones of late meetings, and the occasional echo of a door closing all seem to slow into a rhythm of calm. It is in these quieter hours that whispers seem to drift most clearly. Whispers of files once locked behind steel cabinets. Whispers of reports long dismissed, resurfacing in cautious language. Whispers that remind us that even in the most guarded institutions, silence cannot last forever. For decades, the Pentagon stood as the emblem of certainty and control. When strange lights danced in distant skies, when pilots spoke of objects defying physics, the answer was often the same: weather balloons, atmospheric illusions, radar errors. These responses were neat, official, and absolute, yet outside those walls, the skies remained busy with mysteries. Witnesses continued to speak, and memory continued to hold. Now, in recent years, a shift has begun. Official voices, once rigid in their denials, have softened. New terms have been introduced: unidentified aerial phenomena, phrases crafted carefully, but carrying with them an echo of something older. They mark the first cracks in a wall of silence that had stood since the summer of 1947, a slow transformation from secrecy into cautious acknowledgement. The reports themselves are quiet documents. They do not shout their revelations. They are measured, brief, written in the careful tones of analysts and committees. Yet their words carry weight. They speak of encounters catalogued, objects observed, phenomena that remain unexplained. They admit, gently, that not all things seen in the skies above can be accounted for. In this careful phrasing lies something extraordinary: the acknowledgement of mystery by those who for so long insisted there was none. As we listen tonight, we will trace that journey, from the corridors of denial to the voices of modern witnesses, from leaked videos flickering across computer screens to hearings in marble halls where senators ask questions once considered unfit for serious debate. From international echoes to scientific inquiry, the Pentagon's unfolding story has begun to reshape how we think about the unknown. But here, in this quiet moment, there is no urgency, only reflection. You may picture the Pentagon at night, its walls steady, its windows lit in small clusters, the Potomac River gliding nearby under the silver touch of the moon. Imagine an office where a desk lamp glows faintly, illuminating pages stamped formerly classified. The hum of an air vent fills the silence as someone reads slowly, carefully, their voice low and deliberate, each word recorded, each phrase measured. What they hold is not an answer, but the acknowledgement of a question too long left unspoken. Let that image stay with you as you settle deeper into rest. For tonight's journey is not about certainty, it is about wonder. It is about the quiet transformation of secrecy into speech, and the comfort of knowing that mystery still lingers in the spaces between stars and in the cautious words of those who study them. So let us step together into the story of Pentagon UAP reports, modern disclosure, a story carried not by alarm, but by calm revelation, a story where the silence of decades finally begins to shift, like twilight giving way to night. Chapter 1: Echoes of Silence. The summer of 1947 was unlike any other. The Second World War had ended only 2 years before, leaving the United States in a state of uneasy triumph. Factories shifted from producing bombers and tanks to refrigerators and automobiles. Soldiers who had traveled across oceans returned to their hometowns, bringing with them both stories of devastation and dreams of a future that might finally be free of global conflict. Yet beneath the optimism, shadows lingered. A nuclear age had begun, and with it came a new kind of vigilance. In that atmosphere of transformation, a quiet desert town in New Mexico suddenly became the stage for an event that would ripple across history. Roswell was an unassuming place: dusty roads, modest ranches, a nearby Army airfield that housed the 509th Bomb Group, the only nuclear-capable unit in the world at the time. Life there moved at a slower rhythm, marked by cattle drives and church gatherings. But in July of that year, the desert yielded something far stranger than cattle bones or weather-worn fence posts. A rancher named W. Mac Brazel stumbled upon debris scattered across his land after a summer storm. The pieces glittered strangely in the sun, thin metallic sheets that could not be bent, beams marked with strange violet symbols, and fragments that returned to their shape no matter how he twisted them. Brazel was no stranger to broken balloons or fallen aircraft parts. Roswell's skies had long been filled with military activity, yet this was different. The material seemed impervious to fire, weightless in his hands, unfamiliar to his experience. Brazel carried some of the wreckage into town, showing the fragments to the sheriff. Soon the Army airfield became involved. Major Jesse Marcel, the base intelligence officer, visited the ranch to collect samples. What he saw, he later admitted, did not resemble anything within the Army's inventory. And then came the moment that still echoes through history. The base's public information officer issued a press release declaring that a flying disc had been recovered. The world paused. In the days when newspapers were the heartbeat of public knowledge, the Roswell Daily Record printed the headline in bold letters. Radio stations buzzed with talk of mysterious craft, of the possibility that something not of this earth had fallen into human hands. For one brief moment, the official voice of the U.S. military acknowledged the extraordinary, and then just as quickly, the story was withdrawn. The following day, the Army released new photographs. In them, Major Marcel knelt beside foil and wooden sticks, the remnants of what was described as a weather balloon. The language shifted from certainty to dismissal. What had been extraordinary was now mundane, explained away in the neat, orderly manner of bureaucratic correction. That reversal, the swift journey from acknowledgement to denial, set the template for what would follow over the next half-century. Roswell was no longer merely a local event. It became the first chapter in a larger story of secrecy, ridicule, and silence. For those who had handled the original debris, doubts remained. For witnesses, whispers persisted. But the public narrative had been reset, and the culture of official denial was born. It was not unusual for secrecy to define the era. Only a few years earlier, the Manhattan Project had proven that vast undertakings, cities built in secret, scientists working under code names, discoveries that could alter the course of civilization, could remain hidden from public view until the moment of revelation. In that environment, silence was not an exception, it was the rule. The government had learned how to compartmentalize information, how to bury truths beneath layers of clearance and need-to-know restrictions. The habits of wartime secrecy bled seamlessly into peacetime governance. For the Pentagon, admitting uncertainty was dangerous. The Cold War was already sharpening, with tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union growing by the month. Unknown objects in American skies could not simply be labeled mysteries. To do so would suggest vulnerability. Better to dismiss them, to fold them into categories the public would accept: weather balloons, meteorological tests, atmospheric phenomena. Better to mock those who insisted on stranger explanations, ensuring that their voices remained on the fringes of conversation. And so, a culture took root, a culture in which unexplained sightings were filed away quietly, where witnesses were discouraged from speaking, and where the extraordinary was transformed into the ordinary by official decree. Over time, this culture hardened into policy. Projects would be established, investigations conducted, but always with the understanding that the results must reassure rather than disturb. For ordinary citizens, this silence carried a peculiar weight. Imagine being a rancher who held fragments that would not bend, only to watch the newspapers insist they were sticks and foil. Imagine being a pilot who chased lights that outmaneuvered the fastest aircraft, only to be told it was imagination. The dissonance between experience and explanation created a tension that would endure for generations. Roswell was not only about wreckage in the desert, it was about how institutions choose to shape reality. The lesson was clear: what matters is not always what happened, but how what happened is told. With Roswell, the Pentagon learned to speak in two voices, one fleeting and candid, the other enduring and dismissive. The latter voice became the standard, and its echoes would shape public discourse on UFOs, or what we now call UAPs, for decades. As night falls in our story, picture the New Mexico desert in 1947. The horizon stretches endlessly, the stars glimmering like scattered embers. Somewhere in the distance, a rancher holds a fragment of something strange, something that resists the ordinary. In town, a newspaper headline proclaims the recovery of a flying disc, and in Pentagon offices far away, officials prepare the correction that will close the window as quickly as it opened. It is here, in this cycle of acknowledgement and denial, that the culture of secrecy was born, a silence that would not only bury Roswell, but also shape how every unexplained light, every radar return, and every whispered testimony would be treated in the years to come. After Roswell faded into official dismissal, the story of unidentified objects did not end. Reports continued to flow in from across the country: farmers in the Midwest, pilots along the coasts, radar operators in distant outposts. Lights danced in the skies, discs hovered in silence, and structured craft darted away with impossible speed. By the early 1950s, the pattern was clear enough that the U.S. Air Force felt compelled to respond in a more organized way. Out of this climate of questions and secrecy, Project Blue Book was born. Project Blue Book was, on the surface, a program of study. Its task was to collect, catalog, and analyze reports of unidentified flying objects. In practice, however, it carried another mission: to reassure the public that nothing unusual was happening in the skies above. The project began in 1952 and would span nearly 2 decades, amassing more than 12,000 reports. The vast majority were explained away as stars, weather balloons, or aircraft misidentified in moments of fatigue or atmospheric distortion, but a small percentage, roughly 700 cases, remained unexplained. These were the stubborn echoes, the sightings that resisted categorization. The Cold War was tightening its grip during these years. The Soviet Union had developed nuclear weapons, and the threat of conflict hung over daily life like a low, constant hum. Children practiced duck-and-cover drills in classrooms. Families built fallout shelters in backyards. In this environment, the skies were watched with heightened vigilance. Radar operators scanned for enemy bombers, pilots trained to intercept intruders, and intelligence agencies strained to predict the movements of rival nations. An unidentified object, therefore, was never simply a curiosity. It was a potential threat, and yet the official stance remained dismissive. To admit that unknown craft were maneuvering in controlled airspace was to reveal weakness. So Blue Book's explanations, often stretched thin, served a double purpose. They managed public anxiety and shielded national security concerns. Reports were filed neatly into categories, witnesses were thanked, and conclusions were offered, conclusions that often felt more like cover stories than genuine answers. Still, the phenomenon would not vanish. One of the most striking episodes came in July 1952, when a series of radar and visual sightings occurred over Washington, D.C. For several nights, air traffic controllers, radar operators, and even jet pilots reported unidentified objects maneuvering over the nation's capital. Lights darted across the skies, stopping abruptly, then accelerating at speeds no aircraft could match. Radar screens confirmed what eyes had seen. For a brief time, the press captured the intensity of the moment, running headlines about flying saucers buzzing Washington. The Air Force responded with a press conference, one of the largest since the Second World War. Officials explained the sightings as temperature inversions, mirages caused by layers of warm and cool air. The explanation calmed headlines, but for those who had seen the objects directly, the answer rang hollow. This pattern, extraordinary events followed by mundane explanations, became the rhythm of Project Blue Book. Witnesses described structured craft hovering silently, making right-angle turns at hypersonic speeds. Blue Book reports categorized them as stars, balloons, or atmospheric quirks. The explanations were sometimes plausible, sometimes strained. Always, they reinforced the culture of dismissal. But beneath the public face of reassurance, another layer existed. Intelligence officials quietly worried that at least some of the reports might point to advanced Soviet technology. In an age where radar was young and jet aircraft were still evolving, the possibility that rival nations had developed craft beyond American capabilities was unsettling. Files were shared, sightings were cross-checked, and in quiet rooms, analysts debated possibilities far more serious than swamp gas. Yet these debates rarely left the walls of secure facilities. To the public, the message was simple: nothing to see here. For the men and women who participated in Blue Book, the experience was often complicated. Some investigators genuinely believed the phenomenon deserved serious study. Others saw their role as bureaucratic, categorizing, filing, explaining away. Captain Edward Ruppelt, one of Blue Book's early directors, took the program seriously, seeking to improve its methods and keep an open mind. He coined the term unidentified flying object as a more neutral replacement for the popular phrase flying saucer. In his writings after leaving the Air Force, Ruppelt admitted that while most cases could be explained, a core remained truly mysterious. His candor offered a rare glimpse into the tension at the heart of Blue Book, between investigation and dismissal, between curiosity and control. As the years went on, The files grew heavier. By the late 1960s, thousands of reports had been processed. Public interest waxed and waned, flaring after major sightings, fading in quieter stretches. Finally, in 1969, the Air Force announced the closure of Project Blue Book, citing a study conducted at the University of Colorado under physicist Edward Condon. The Condon report concluded that UFOs presented no threat to national security, offered no evidence of advanced technology, and did not warrant further scientific study. With those words, the official door closed once again. The files were shelved, the project disbanded, and the culture of silence reaffirmed. And yet, even in closure, questions lingered. The unexplained cases, hundreds of them, remained unexplained. The witnesses who had spoken of extraordinary things were never refuted, only ignored. The Cold War continued, the nuclear arms race escalated, and the skies remained both a frontier and a mystery. Imagine now the atmosphere of those years: radar screens glowing in dim rooms, pilots straining their eyes against the night horizon, families glancing upward during summer evenings, wondering about lights that drifted strangely across the heavens. The Pentagon, the Air Force, the intelligence community, they all worked to impose order, to explain, to reassure. But beneath it all, the mystery endured, woven quietly into the background of an anxious nuclear age. By the time Project Blue Book closed its doors in 1969, a cultural pattern had been firmly established. The official story was one of dismissal. UFOs, or unidentified aerial phenomena, as some quietly preferred to call them, were presented as curiosities at best, misperceptions at worst. They were not threats, they were not evidence of advanced technology, and they certainly were not worthy of continued investigation. That was the message. The silence that had begun with Roswell had matured into a strategy, carefully constructed, deliberately maintained, and deeply woven into both government institutions and public imagination. This strategy was subtle. It was not enforced with heavy-handed censorship or dramatic cover-ups, but with the quiet pressure of ridicule. When someone reported seeing something strange in the sky, the response was rarely overt hostility. Instead, it came in the form of chuckles, raised eyebrows, and dismissive remarks. To speak of flying saucers was to risk one's reputation. Pilots feared being grounded. Military personnel feared ridicule in their files. Ordinary citizens feared being branded eccentric. Silence became the safer path, and in that silence, the phenomenon was allowed to continue without serious challenge. Ridicule as a tool was effective. Newspapers that once ran bold headlines about discs and lights shifted toward cartoons and playful skepticism. The very idea of UFOs became a kind of cultural joke, folded into comic books, late-night radio, and science fiction. Television shows portrayed them as entertainment, strange stories for curious minds, rather than as phenomena worthy of serious study. The more the subject was laughed at, the less threatening it became. And yet, in the margins, the witnesses remained: the pilots, the radar operators, the farmers and families, people whose experiences did not vanish simply because society chose not to listen. For the Pentagon, this outcome was convenient. The Cold War was a time of profound secrecy. Every unexplained radar return was potentially an enemy aircraft, every unidentified light, possibly a rival's weapon. To admit that there were objects behaving in ways that defied explanation would raise uncomfortable questions about control. By encouraging a culture of dismissal, officials managed both the public's curiosity and their own vulnerability. The mystery was not solved, but it was contained. This containment extended beyond the United States. Allied nations often followed similar patterns. In the United Kingdom, files were collected, reports were logged, but the official line was consistently one of reassurance and denial. In France, Canada, Australia, and elsewhere, the same dynamic appeared: acknowledgement of reports, followed by dismissal, all framed in careful, measured tones. Silence was not only a Pentagon strategy, it was an international one. Yet within intelligence circles, the questions never fully disappeared. Analysts knew that not every radar return was a weather anomaly, not every pilot report a hallucination. Documents circulated quietly, marked for official use only, containing descriptions that sounded far stranger than the public would ever hear. But those documents rarely escaped their vaults, and when they did, they were often redacted into shadows of their original form. For the men and women who had seen something extraordinary, the decades of dismissal carried a personal weight. Pilots described the burden of memory, moments when they had chased lights across the sky, only to return to debriefings where their accounts were met with silence or skepticism. Farmers recalled finding scorched patches in their fields, only to be told they were looking at lightning strikes. Entire families whispered their stories at dinner tables, careful not to share them with neighbors. In this way, the phenomenon lived on, not in official reports, but in human memory, passed quietly from one generation to the next. By the late 20th century, UFOs had become paradoxical. On one hand, they were ridiculed, associated with fringe beliefs and outlandish stories. On the other, they were a constant presence in popular culture. Movies, novels, and television shows kept the idea alive in the public imagination. This dual existence ensured that the subject never disappeared entirely. It remained hidden in plain sight, dismissed on the surface, yet deeply embedded in cultural consciousness. Imagine now the atmosphere of those decades: the hum of a living room television, playing black and white news footage of rockets and astronauts, while in another part of town, someone quietly marks a journal entry about a strange light over the horizon. In Pentagon offices, men in uniform review radar logs, deciding which reports will be filed as anomalies and which will be forgotten. Outside, children play games of spacemen and flying saucers, unaware that the very phrase is born from reports once taken seriously, now treated as fantasy. This was how silence became strategy, not through loud denials, but through steady, quiet discouragement, not by suppressing all information, but by shaping it carefully, ensuring that whatever mystery remained was seen as harmless, laughable, or irrelevant. And yet, beneath the laughter, the mystery continued, stubborn and silent, waiting for the day when the strategy of ridicule would falter and new voices would finally be heard. Chapter 2. The modern witnesses emerge. The Pacific Ocean stretched out in endless silver blue. On November 14th, 2004, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was conducting routine training exercises off the coast of Southern California. The air was calm, the seas steady beneath the steel hulls of some of the most advanced warships in the world. For the sailors on deck and the pilots in their cockpits, it was another day of drills, launches, landings, radar tracking, and the endless cycle of preparation that defined naval life. Yet on this particular day, something extraordinary unfolded in those skies. It began quietly, almost unremarkably. Radar operators aboard the USS Princeton, a guided missile cruiser in the strike group, noticed unusual returns on their screens. The contacts appeared at high altitude, then dropped to sea level in seconds, hovering motionless above the waves before vanishing. The anomalies repeated, stubborn and consistent. At first, Operators wondered if their equipment was malfunctioning, but the systems were tested and confirmed. The contacts were real, something solid, structured, and moving with impossible physics was in the airspace around them. The decision was made to send aircraft to investigate. Among the pilots was Commander David Fravor, a seasoned naval aviator with thousands of flight hours and years of experience in some of the Navy's most advanced jets. Calm, disciplined, and respected by his peers, Fravor was not a man prone to exaggeration. His mission was routine: intercept the unknown contacts and identify them. Yet what he encountered that day would defy everything he knew about flight. Flying in an FA-18 Super Hornet, Fravor was vectored toward the anomalous radar tracks. As he approached the coordinates, he scanned the sea below. What he saw left him stunned. Hovering just above the ocean's surface was an object, white, featureless, shaped like a smooth capsule. It was about 40 feet long, with no wings, no engines, no visible means of propulsion. Its movements were sharp and deliberate, as if guided by unseen rails. The object darted from side to side, then stopped, hovering silently above the waves. Below it, the ocean churned, as though something massive were just beneath the surface. The water foamed and roiled in a patch the size of a football field, though nothing was visible within. Fravor and his wingman circled, watching in disbelief. The object rose suddenly, accelerating with such speed that the pilots could not match it. Fravor banked hard, maneuvering to intercept. The capsule responded instantly, mirroring his movements, anticipating his angles, and darting away with ease. For several minutes, the encounter played out like a dance. Fravor's jet, lunging forward, the object slipping away, each move answered with a precision that felt both intelligent and impossible. Then, in an instant, the object vanished. It accelerated upward and disappeared from sight, leaving only the calm ocean below and the stunned voices of trained pilots trying to make sense of what they had seen. Fravor's account has become one of the most famous testimonies in modern UAP history. His words, delivered not with sensationalism, but with the measured tone of a professional aviator, carry a weight that speculation cannot easily dismiss. He described the object as moving like a ping-pong ball inside a glass box, bouncing in ways no known aircraft could. There was no exhaust, no sound, no wings, no heat signature visible, yet it maneuvered with power and intelligence that seemed to exceed the boundaries of physics itself. Back aboard the carrier, debriefings unfolded in hushed tones. Pilots shared what they had seen. Radar operators confirmed the strange returns. There was no laughter, no easy explanations. What they had encountered was real, tangible, and undeniable. Still, the official reports would later describe the incident in careful, restrained language. The mystery remained unclassified in spirit, but unspoken in practice. For Fravor, the event was transformative. He had spent his career mastering the skies, flying against adversaries, and training for every scenario the Navy could imagine. Yet nothing in his experience prepared him for the white capsule that moved without inertia, without wings, without explanation. Years later, when the Pentagon began to acknowledge the existence of UAPs, Fravor's testimony resurfaced, becoming a cornerstone of modern disclosure. Imagine the scene in calmer tones, the vast Pacific stretching endlessly beneath the wings of a jet, the ocean breathing with slow, steady waves. Above it all, a featureless object glides with impossible grace, indifferent to human pursuit. In that moment, the mystery was no longer distant, no longer the stuff of rumor. It was present, immediate, undeniable, and recorded in the memories of disciplined men and women who carried the burden of truth into silence. Years after Commander Fravor's encounter off the Pacific, another set of voices began to rise from a different ocean. This time, it was the Atlantic. Along the eastern seaboard of the United States, naval aviators training out of Virginia and Florida began to notice something unsettling in their skies. These were not isolated events, not fleeting glimpses that could be dismissed as tricks of the eye. These sightings were frequent, sometimes daily, unfolding over weeks and months, with a consistency that forced even the most skeptical minds to pause. One of the first to speak openly was Lieutenant Ryan Graves, a Navy FELS A-18 pilot with years of service and thousands of flight hours. Calm, composed, and not one to seek headlines, Graves carried himself with the quiet authority of a professional who valued precision over drama. His story was simple but remarkable. Unidentified objects were appearing in military training airspace almost every day. The encounters began in earnest around 2014. Pilots noticed objects that seemed to hover motionless, even against strong winds, or to dart away at speeds beyond any known aircraft. They had no wings, no exhaust plumes, no visible engines. Some appeared as small cubes enclosed within transparent spheres. Others were more ambiguous, dark shapes that registered clearly on radar but evaded identification through ordinary optics. At times, these objects lingered directly in restricted training zones, ignoring the invisible boundaries drawn by human order. Radar operators aboard ships and aircraft confirmed the contacts. These were not fleeting glitches or atmospheric anomalies. Advanced sensors tracked them repeatedly, locking onto objects that seemed solid, maneuverable, and entirely unbothered by the presence of military patrols. The pilot's frustration grew. Training flights, worth millions of dollars, and countless hours of preparation were disrupted by unknown intruders. And unlike traditional adversaries, these objects never responded, never broadcast signals, never acted as though they were even aware of the human machines buzzing around them. The danger was not abstract. On more than one occasion, aviators reported near collisions, a jet roaring through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour suddenly found an object hanging motionless in its flight path. The pilot would bank hard, pulling against G-forces, narrowly avoiding disaster. These were not theoretical risks. They were moments when lives could have been lost, not through malice, but through the indifference of something unexplained. For Ryan Graves and his fellow aviators, the challenge was twofold. There was the practical matter of safety. How could pilots train effectively with objects they could not predict sharing their airspace? And there was the larger question: what were these things? Were they foreign drones, testing the limits of American defenses? Were they experimental technologies unknown even to the Navy itself? Or were they something entirely different, belonging to no flag, no nation, no familiar category? At first, reporting these encounters felt awkward. Pilots knew the history, how UFO sightings had been ridiculed for decades. To speak openly was to risk reputation, but as the incidents mounted, silence became impossible. Aviators brought their accounts to commanding officers. Logs were kept, radar data was reviewed, and eventually the reports reached the highest levels of the Navy. When Graves later spoke publicly, it was with the same measured tone he carried in the cockpit. He did not describe aliens, nor did he claim certainty. He simply recounted what he and his colleagues had seen, what they had tracked, and what they had nearly collided with. Every day for years, he said, there were objects in our airspace. His words were not sensational, they were steady, deliberate, and all the more powerful for their restraint. Imagine now the Atlantic skies. The horizon stretches endlessly, the ocean below glistening in sunlight, its surface alive with rolling waves. High above, fighter jets carve their paths through the air, the roar of engines a constant backdrop. And then, motionless against the wind, silent against the noise, an object hovers indifferent, unmoved, unexplainable. Pilots mark its position, adjust their course, and wonder what presence they are sharing the sky with. For radar operators, the glow of screens confirmed what eyes had already seen. Blips moved with consistency, held positions, vanished, and reappeared. The data was undeniable. For the aviators, the burden was no longer in convincing themselves of what they saw, but in convincing others that the skies were not as empty as everyone assumed. These daily encounters, spoken of first in closed rooms and later in public testimony, carried the story of UAPs into a new era. They were not rare anomalies. They were persistent, repeatable, and observed by some of the most trained eyes in advanced systems in the world. The silence of earlier decades no longer seemed sustainable. The voices of modern witnesses were finally breaking through. For decades, those who reported unidentified aerial phenomena often carried the weight of disbelief on their shoulders. A farmer who spoke of strange lights in his fields was thought eccentric. A police officer who described a craft hovering over a highway risked becoming the subject of jokes. Even military pilots, disciplined and trained to read the sky with precision, hesitated to speak openly, knowing that ridicule or career damage could follow. But something changed as the 21st century unfolded. The testimonies no longer came only from civilians with fleeting glimpses. They began arriving from naval aviators, radar operators, and officers whose professional lives depended on accurate observation. These were individuals accustomed to speaking in the language of precision, altitudes, speeds, bearings, and signatures. Their reputations were built on reliability, and when they began to describe objects moving with impossible physics, the burden of credibility shifted. Consider the case of Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Ryan Graves. Both men spoke publicly, not in sensational tones, but with the steady cadence of professionals recalling training exercises and cockpit procedures. Fravor's tic-tac encounter off the Pacific and Graves's daily sightings in the Atlantic were not told as stories for entertainment. They were testimonies, delivered with the quiet gravity of men used to briefing rooms and flight debriefs. When such voices described impossible movements, instantaneous acceleration, right-angle turns without inertia, silent hovering, the dismissive laughter that once followed UFO accounts became harder to summon. The credibility was reinforced by technology. Radar systems, infrared sensors, and cockpit recordings corroborated the pilot's words. In the past, a witness stood alone with memory as evidence. Now screens glowed with signatures, cameras recorded heat trails, and data logged maneuvers that defied the known capabilities of aircraft. The combination of human testimony and technological confirmation made the reports more difficult to ignore. This shift did not happen overnight. For years, officials still leaned on the strategy of silence. Explanations were withheld, language softened, and public statements carefully crafted to minimize alarm. But behind closed doors, the tone was changing. Navy briefings began to acknowledge the issue. New reporting procedures were established, giving aviators channels to log encounters without stigma. The message was subtle but clear. These reports were not to be mocked, but taken seriously. The pilots themselves felt the difference. Where once they hesitated to speak, they now found receptive ears. Ryan Graves testified that before new procedures, pilots would often simply stop talking about what they saw, choosing silence over ridicule. But with official acknowledgement, silence was no longer the only option. Testimonies began to circulate, first within the Navy and later within Congress. The voices of professionals, long muted by culture, were finally given room to breathe. In public, the shift appeared as a gradual softening. News outlets that once treated UFOs as curiosities began to cover UAPs as matters of national security. Journalists interviewed aviators and intelligence officers without framing them as eccentric. Senators and representatives spoke of the issue with the language of defense and safety rather than mockery. The very term unidentified aerial phenomena was a reflection of this change, removing the stigma of flying saucers and replacing it with something measured, clinical, and serious. For the witnesses, this change mattered deeply. Testifying to experiences that defied explanation had long been a lonely burden, but now they spoke with the knowledge that they were not alone, that their words were being recorded in hearings, entered into reports, and discussed at the highest levels of government. The shift did not provide answers, no definitive conclusions about what the objects were, but it provided something almost as important: acknowledgement. Imagine the feeling of a pilot returning from a mission, standing in a debrief room with fellow aviators and commanding officers. Once, to describe an encounter with an unidentified object would have been to invite smirks or silence. Now the same words are logged, entered into official channels, preserved in records that might shape future policy. The burden of credibility no longer falls entirely on the individual. It is shared, recognized, and in its own quiet way, respected. This was the moment when the long arc of dismissal began to bend toward acknowledgement. The voices of modern witnesses had not only emerged, they had found ears willing to listen, and in that shift, the path toward disclosure, however cautious, began to take shape. Chapter 3. 3 Videos That Changed Everything. Section 1. The Leaked Footage. For years, the stories lived mostly in testimony. Pilots, radar operators, and the occasional civilian who caught a glimpse of something strange in the sky. But words, however steady and sincere, could always be questioned. Memory could be doubted, perception second-guessed. What shifted the conversation in the modern era were images, grainy, black and white, captured by some of the most advanced sensors in the world. The first of these was a short, silent clip known as FLIR 1, recorded in 2004 during the same series of encounters that brought Commander David Fravor face to face with the Tic Tac object. The video was captured by the targeting camera of a Navy FA-18 Super Hornet. Against the monochrome haze of infrared, a small oval object drifts, tilts, and accelerates across the frame. There are no wings, no exhaust, no heat signature trailing behind it. The camera struggles to lock on as the object darts suddenly, shifting position with movements that seem unconstrained by inertia. To a casual viewer, it looks simple, a small white dot against a gray screen. To aviators and analysts, it is a record of something extraordinary. Then came the gimbal video, captured in 2015 off the coast of Florida. In this footage, the object is larger, disc-like, with a pronounced central bulge. The most striking moment is not only its presence, but its motion. As Navy pilots track it, their voices, usually clipped and calm, betray surprise. The object rotates slowly, smoothly, tilting against the wind, as though some invisible hand turns it in place. "Look at that thing," one voice says, tinged with awe. "It's rotating." The words, carried in calm but astonished tones, became etched into the story of modern disclosure. A third clip, known as "Go Fast," shows an object skimming just above the surface of the ocean at remarkable speed. Captured again by advanced targeting systems, the small object zips across the waves, holding steady as it outruns the horizon itself. Pilots can be heard marveling at the speed, struggling to understand how something so small, so silent, could move so quickly without visible propulsion. The object leaves no wake on the water, no exhaust in the air, only the undeniable fact of its movement recorded on Navy systems. Taken together, the three videos, FLIR.1, Gimbal, and Go Fast, formed a mosaic of mystery. They were not cinematic, they were not polished. They looked, in fact, rather ordinary, white smudges on dark backgrounds, accompanied by the clipped banter of pilots. Yet that ordinariness was precisely what gave them power. These were not special effects. They were not produced for entertainment. They were fragments of training missions, preserved by the same machines that guided missiles and identified threats. When the videos leaked into public view, they spread quickly, first through specialized circles of researchers and journalists, then across headlines and television screens. For the first time, the public could see what military pilots had long described. The dots and shapes on screen became anchors for testimonies, points of reference that could not be brushed aside as imagination. In 2017, the New York Times published an article that brought the videos into the mainstream. The story revealed not only the existence of the footage, but also a secret Pentagon program, the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATP, that had quietly studied such phenomena for years. The combination of credible journalism, official documentation, and undeniable video evidence shifted the conversation dramatically. What had once been ridiculed as fringe became a subject of serious inquiry. The videos themselves did not reveal answers. Analysts debated whether the movements were illusions, camera artifacts, or reflections of truly revolutionary craft. Skeptics offered explanations rooted in sensor limitations. Believers saw confirmation of something extraordinary. Yet the central fact remained: the U.S. military had recorded objects that defied ordinary classification, and those recordings were now in the public domain. Imagine watching one of these clips late at night, the glow of the screen casting pale light across a quiet room. The footage is grainy, the object small, yet the implications immense. You hear the voices of trained pilots, calm professionals surprised, and you realize that their astonishment is genuine. The dots on the screen may be simple, but behind them lies a question too large to ignore. What exactly is sharing our skies? The leaked footage marked a turning point. It transformed whispers into visible evidence, memory into something that could be replayed, frame by frame, and in doing so, it helped pry open the door of secrecy that had been held shut for decades. The release of the Navy videos, FLIR-1, Gimbal, and Go Fast, did not end the mystery. In many ways, it deepened it. For every pilot astonished by what he had seen, there was an analyst trained to search for ordinary explanations. Inside the Pentagon, in the quiet offices where reports are weighed and cross-checked, debate unfolded with the same measured tones that had shaped official language for decades. The difference now was that the evidence was not hidden in filing cabinets. It was out in the open, replayed on screens around the world. Some analysts approached the videos with caution, pointing to the possibility of sensor artifacts. The targeting pods used by Navy jets are highly advanced but not infallible. Infrared cameras can create distortions when they lock onto objects at extreme distances. Reflections, glare, and atmospheric interference might explain the strange rotations, the sudden accelerations, the absence of exhaust trails. In this view, the mystery lay not in the skies, but in the limitations of technology itself. Others countered that the data was too consistent to dismiss. The objects were not just captured by one system, they were observed across multiple platforms. Radar operators aboard ships tracked them. Pilots saw them visually. Infrared sensors recorded their heat signatures, or more often, the absence of them. The convergence of human testimony and technical confirmation, these analysts argued, suggested that something real and structured was being observed. To reduce the events to optical illusions was to ignore the full weight of the evidence. The gimbal video, in particular, sparked intense discussion. The slow rotation of the object, captured so clearly against the infrared background, seemed to defy ordinary aerodynamics. Some engineers suggested that the rotation was not the craft itself, but a gimbal artifact, a quirk of the camera system that gave the illusion of movement. Others noted that the pilots' voices in the recording revealed genuine surprise. These were aviators trained on the equipment, familiar with its quirks. If they expressed astonishment, it was not likely born of ignorance. The Go Fast video raised similar debates. To some, the object skimming above the ocean at extraordinary speed was simply a bird or debris, its motion exaggerated by the angle of the tracking system. Yet calculations made by independent experts suggested that the object was moving far faster than any natural explanation could support. The lack of a wake on the water below only added to the puzzle. Could a bird or balloon maintain such velocity without leaving any trace? Or was this, as some suggested, a glimpse of propulsion technologies beyond human reach? Within the Pentagon, the discussions carried more weight than in the public sphere. National security was always the underlying concern. If the objects were foreign drones, advanced technologies from rival nations, then the implications were staggering. Such capabilities would represent a leap ahead of anything publicly known, challenging the very foundations of defense planning. If, on the other hand, the objects were not of human origin at all, the questions became larger still, reaching into realms that defied easy categorization. Yet the language remained careful. Analysts spoke of anomalous aerial vehicles, of unidentified aerial phenomena, terms chosen with deliberate restraint. The words avoided speculation, avoided alarm, and left space for ambiguity. Behind those words, however, the debate was alive. Engineers, pilots, intelligence officers all weighed in, each from their own discipline, each bringing perspectives that sometimes clashed and sometimes converged. For the public, the debates echoed in headlines and interviews. Skeptics urged caution, reminding audiences that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Advocates pointed to the convergence of testimonies, radar returns, and video footage as evidence already extraordinary. Neither side had conclusive answers, but both agreed on one truth. The videos could not simply be ignored. Imagine the scene inside a Pentagon briefing room. A projector hums softly, replaying the grainy infrared footage. Around the table sit men and women in uniform, intelligence officers, scientists, engineers. Some lean forward, pointing to details on the screen. Others fold their arms, skeptical, reminding the group of sensor limitations. The conversation is calm, deliberate, professional, but beneath the surface lies a quiet recognition that the mystery refuses to dissolve under scrutiny. The debate itself became part of the story. For the first time in decades, official voices acknowledged that some things seen in the skies remain unexplained, not dismissed, not ridiculed, but admitted as unknown. That admission, however measured, marked a profound shift. For decades, the subject of UFOs had existed in two separate worlds. In one, the classified halls of the Pentagon and intelligence agencies, files were quietly collected, data archived, and testimony weighed in confidential settings. In the other, the public sphere, stories trickled out through newspapers, magazines, and late-night radio, often greeted with ridicule or curiosity, but rarely with seriousness. Between these two worlds stood a wall, built from secrecy, skepticism, and the careful shaping of narratives. When the Navy videos, FLIR-1, Gimbal and Go Fast, entered the public domain, that wall cracked. Suddenly, evidence long confined to closed rooms was accessible to anyone with a screen. The mystery was no longer whispered in private or relegated to fringe speculation. It was right there, replayed endlessly online, dissected by analysts and enthusiasts alike. The distance between classified and curious narrowed in a way not seen since Roswell's fleeting headlines in 1947. The impact was immediate. News outlets that once hesitated to cover UFOs began running serious reports. The New York Times, the Washington Post, and major television networks devoted segments to the footage, interviewing Navy pilots and Pentagon officials. The tone was no longer mocking. It was cautious, measured, even respectful. Words like credible and unexplained appeared in headlines once filled with dismissive phrases. The cultural weight of seeing trained aviators astonished on camera could not be easily brushed aside. For researchers who had spent decades on the margins, the release felt like vindication. Scholars and investigators who had collected testimonies, filed Freedom of Information Act requests, and cataloged sightings finally saw the subject break into mainstream recognition. It was no longer a matter of convincing the world that something unusual was happening. The Navy's own footage, paired with the Pentagon's acknowledgement, had done that. The task now was to ask, what comes next? The videos also sparked curiosity far beyond the usual circles. Scientists, engineers, and policymakers began to weigh in. Some urged caution, emphasizing the need for careful analysis and warning against leaping to conclusions. Others noted the profound implications if even a fraction of the encounters were exactly as they appeared. If objects could truly move without visible propulsion, accelerate instantly, or defy known aerodynamics, then physics itself was facing a challenge. Even if the explanation lay within human technology, advanced drones or experimental craft, the leap ahead of known capabilities was startling. Public fascination grew as well. Online communities dissected the footage frame by frame, analyzing every rotation, every shift in the grainy images. Some pointed to optical illusions, others argued for extraordinary propulsion systems. Forums filled with diagrams, theories, and speculations, blending amateur enthusiasm with genuine expertise. For many, the debates themselves were as captivating as the videos, offering a sense of participation in a mystery that had once been hidden behind layers of classification. Inside the Pentagon, the release carried both promise and risk. On one hand, it provided justification for continued study. If the public now recognized the seriousness of the phenomenon, then resources could be allocated, programs renewed, and investigations expanded. On the other hand, it opened officials to questions they could not fully answer. What are these objects? Where do they come from? What do they want? Questions that, even if asked in calm tones, carried the weight of existential wonder. The wall between classified and curious was not demolished entirely. Much remained hidden: data, radar logs, classified reports. But the release of the videos created a breach wide enough for conversation to flow. For the first time in decades, the public and the Pentagon were speaking the same language, even if only in fragments. The phenomenon was no longer a matter of imagination. It was a matter of record. Imagine sitting in a quiet living room, the lights dimmed, a news broadcast playing softly. On the screen, grainy footage shows a white shape darting across gray skies, while the voice of a Navy pilot exclaims in wonder. You feel the subtle shift, the realization that what was once dismissed is now acknowledged. The mystery has crossed from rumor into reality, from secrecy into cautious speech. The wall has cracked, and through it flows the quiet, steady hum of disclosure. Chapter 4: The AATIP Legacy Unveiled. Behind the polished briefings and the cautious words of official reports lies another layer of the Pentagon's history with UAPs, a quieter, more concealed chapter. For years, most Americans assumed that after Project Blue Book's closure in 1969, the government had simply stepped away from the subject. The official line was clear: UFOs posed no threat, revealed no advanced technology, and required no further study. That was the story, neat and final. Yet behind the curtain of public declarations, in the labyrinth of defense budgets and classified appropriations, the story continued. In 2007, buried within the vast network of the Pentagon's spending, a new program was born. It was called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, or AATIP. Its funding, $22 million, was a modest sum by defense standards, barely a ripple in the ocean of military budgets. But its mission was anything but ordinary. The program was tasked with investigating unidentified aerial phenomena, collecting data, analyzing encounters, and assessing potential implications for national security. The program's existence remained secret for nearly a decade. Hidden within what is often called the black budget, its funds were tucked away under broader appropriations, invisible to the casual observer. To those inside the Pentagon, this was not unusual. Advanced projects, stealth aircraft, missile defense systems, experimental propulsion were often shielded by the same methods. Yet the focus of AATIP was different. It was not about developing new weapons or defending against known threats. It was about studying what could not yet be explained. At the heart of AATIP's creation was a handful of determined voices. Among them was Senator Harry Reid of Nevada, who had long cultivated an interest in national security issues that pushed the boundaries of conventional defense. Reid, along with fellow Senators Daniel Inouye of Hawaii and Ted Stevens of Alaska, quietly secured funding for the program. The justification was framed carefully. In an age of rapidly advancing technology, the United States could not afford to ignore reports of craft displaying capabilities far beyond known aviation. If foreign adversaries were responsible, the stakes were grave. If the origins were something else, the implications were even larger. AATIP's work unfolded in quiet offices and secure facilities. Analysts reviewed military encounters, studied radar logs, and sifted through pilot testimonies. They examined patterns in sightings, locations, shapes, movements, and compared them against known aircraft and experimental drones. The files grew steadily, filled with diagrams, equations, and transcripts. Some of the cases aligned with ordinary explanations. Others, however, resisted all attempts at categorization. What set AATIP apart was its willingness to consider possibilities outside conventional frameworks. Documents associated with the program reveal explorations of advanced propulsion concepts, warp drives, wormholes, and other ideas more often found in theoretical physics than defense briefings. To outside eyes, these explorations might seem speculative, even fantastical, but within the program, the reasoning was clear. If the phenomena being observed truly operated beyond current human technology, then only by expanding the boundaries of study could progress be made. And yet, AATIP was never a large operation. With limited funding and a small staff, its reach was modest compared to sprawling defense projects. Its existence was known to only a select few, and even within the Pentagon, many remained unaware. For nearly a decade, it worked in obscurity, its findings shared only with a handful of officials. To the public, the silence remained intact. It was only in 2017, when the New York Times revealed both the Navy videos and the hidden program behind them, that AATIP stepped into the light. The article described how millions of dollars had been quietly directed towards studying unidentified phenomena, how encounters like Fravors had been analyzed in detail, and how officials had wrestled with implications far beyond conventional threats. For many, the revelation was startling. The government, which had long claimed disinterest, had in fact continued its study just beneath the surface, just beyond public view. Imagine now the atmosphere of that hidden study. A quiet office deep within the Pentagon, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. On a desk, a stack of radar logs, annotated in careful handwriting. A monitor replays grainy footage of a white capsule darting across the screen. An analyst leans forward, rubbing tired eyes, wondering if the equations on the page, projections of acceleration and velocity, are even possible within known physics. The room is small, the work obscure, but the questions are vast. The legacy of AATIP was not in answers, but in acknowledgement. It demonstrated that, despite decades of dismissal, the Pentagon had never truly turned away. The mystery had simply been relocated from public reports into black budgets, from headlines into classified files. And in that relocation, the story of secrecy continued, waiting for the day when its existence would no longer remain hidden. Inside the Pentagon, programs come and go with little fanfare. Budgets shift, priorities change, and offices quietly close their doors. But sometimes, the end of a program is not just a bureaucratic adjustment. It is a turning point for the people within it. Such was the case for Luis Elizondo, a career intelligence officer who would become one of the central figures in bringing AATP and the larger UAP issue into public light. Elizondo had spent decades working in sensitive areas of national security. His career took him into counterintelligence operations, field assignments in conflict zones, and leadership roles in protecting the United States from hidden threats. By the time he became involved with the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, he was already seasoned, familiar with the heavy weight of secrecy and responsibility. Yet AATP confronted him with something that stretched beyond the usual language of defense. It asked him to look at phenomena that not only challenged military readiness, but also the very boundaries of human understanding. As reports flowed in, pilots describing objects defying known physics, radar systems capturing movements beyond known propulsion, Elizondo became increasingly convinced that the phenomena deserved serious attention. He was not alone. Analysts, engineers, and officers working alongside him shared the sense that something real and significant was unfolding in the skies. But outside their small circle, support was thin. Funding remained modest, access limited, and interest from higher levels inconsistent. Over time, frustration grew. To Elizondo, the issue was not whether the objects were alien or foreign, but that they were real and unexplained. To ignore them, he felt, was to ignore a potential threat, or perhaps a potential opportunity. He argued for more resources, more transparency, more willingness to confront the unknown without ridicule. Again and again, his appeals were met with indifference or resistance. In 2017, after years of effort, Elizondo reached a breaking point. He drafted a resignation letter, one that would later become public, in which he outlined his concerns. He wrote of the danger of continuing to dismiss phenomena documented by some of the nation's most advanced systems and most trusted personnel. He described the cultural stigma that still surrounded the subject, how serious reports were too often brushed aside because they carried the old weight of mockery. Most of all, he expressed disappointment that a matter of such potential importance received so little attention from those in power. Leaving the Pentagon was not an easy decision. A career in intelligence often means sacrifice, long hours, personal risk, and the quiet acceptance that much of one's work will never be recognized. To step outside that world and to speak publicly about something so deeply stigmatized carried its own risks. Elizondo knew he would face skepticism, perhaps even ridicule, but he also knew that silence, in this case, was no longer sustainable. After his resignation, Elizondo began to speak more openly. Partnering with former officials and researchers, he brought AATP into the public eye. His testimony was calm, measured, and rooted in his professional experience. He did not claim to have definitive answers. Instead, he framed the issue in terms of national security and scientific curiosity. Objects were intruding into restricted airspace, maneuvering with unknown technologies, and evading the defenses of the most powerful military on Earth. That fact alone, he argued, warranted attention. For Elizondo, the personal cost was real. Some dismissed him as seeking publicity, while others accused him of exaggeration. Yet those who listened closely heard the quiet frustration of a man who had tried to work within the system and found it unwilling to change. His words resonated with pilots, analysts, and citizens who had long felt that their testimonies were ignored. Imagine Elizondo late at night, the glow of a desk lamp illuminating his resignation letter. Outside the Pentagon, the Washington night hums softly, traffic, distant voices, the steady rhythm of a city built on secrets. Inside, he writes carefully, each word chosen not to sensationalize, but to record a truth that something extraordinary is happening in the skies, and that ignoring it is no longer an option. The letter becomes both an ending and a beginning, a departure from one role and the opening of another, far more public. In stepping away from the shadows, Elizondo carried with him the story of AATIP, the hidden study, the unexplained encounters, and the stubborn persistence of mystery. His choice to speak, despite the personal cost, marked another crack in the long wall of silence. Through him, the quiet files of the Pentagon began to echo in the public world, reshaping how we think about the skies above. For much of modern history, the corridors of the Pentagon have been defined by silence. Those who walked them carried secrets, bound by clearances and oaths, their work hidden even from colleagues in adjacent offices. In that world, speaking openly about classified matters is unthinkable. Careers depend on discretion, reputations are tied to secrecy, and even whispers can bring heavy consequences. Yet from time to time, individuals choose a different path. They step from the shadows into the light, trading comfort for risk, silence for voice. In the story of UAPs, these insiders turned whistleblowers played a decisive role. Luis Elizondo was not the first, nor will he be the last. His decision to resign and speak publicly about the Pentagon's quiet investigations marked a turning point, but it was part of a broader pattern. Across agencies and branches of service, men and women who encountered the unexplained found themselves torn between duty to secrecy and duty to truth. Some remained silent, carrying their experiences privately. Others chose to share, cautiously at first, then with growing determination. Each act of disclosure required courage, not only against ridicule, but against the weight of institutions built to discourage dissent. Inside the Pentagon, to raise concerns about unidentified phenomena was to invite suspicion. Was the witness misinterpreting radar? Were they chasing illusions? The culture of dismissal, cultivated since Roswell, lingered stubbornly. Yet the encounters did not cease. Pilots returned from missions with stories of objects darting away at impossible speeds. Radar operators logged tracks that moved against wind and gravity. Intelligence analysts filed reports that concluded with the same line, written again and again, unknown. To keep silent was to deny the reality of those encounters. To speak was to risk everything. What makes whistleblowing in this arena so striking is not the revelation of answers, but the insistence on questions. Elizondo and others who stepped forward did not claim knowledge of extraterrestrial origins. They did not present alien artifacts or dramatic evidence. Instead, they emphasized the need to acknowledge what had already been observed, that trained professionals, using advanced systems, were recording phenomena that defied known explanation. In a world where certainty is prized, it was an act of courage to admit uncertainty. Consider the atmosphere in which these disclosures occurred. The Pentagon is not a place that easily bends to curiosity. Decisions are measured, hierarchies rigid, and language precise. Within its walls, silence is often equated with safety. To break that silence is to step against a current as powerful as the Potomac itself. Yet whistleblowers did so, guided by the quiet conviction that some truths, however incomplete, deserve to be spoken aloud. The cost was not only professional, families too bore the weight. To speak of UFOs, now UAPs, was to invite attention, sometimes hostile, often skeptical. Children heard classmates repeat rumors. Spouses watched reputations shift in the press. The choice to speak was rarely a simple act of defiance. It was a burden shared quietly by those closest to the whistleblower. And still the voices rose. Their courage reshaped the conversation. Congressional hearings that once would have been unthinkable began to unfold. Journalists treated the subject with seriousness, seeking documents, interviewing witnesses, and cross-checking accounts. Scientists too felt freer to ask questions, to wonder whether physics itself might hold surprises waiting to be uncovered. The wall of silence that had stood for decades did not collapse in one moment. It cracked piece by piece under the weight of those who dared to speak. Imagine the scene of a whistleblower walking down a Pentagon corridor late at night. The building hums with fluorescent light. Footsteps echo softly against marble floors. In a briefcase rests a resignation letter, or perhaps documents prepared for release. Outside, Washington glitters with city lights, unaware of the small act of defiance about to ripple outward. The whistleblower pauses, knowing that once the words leave their mouth, there is no return to silence. The moment is quiet, but within it lies a revolution. The courage of insiders who became whistleblowers lies not in the answers they provided, but in the questions they forced the world to confront. They transformed secrecy into conversation, ridicule into recognition. In their voices, the long strategy of silence faltered, and the journey toward disclosure began to find its footing. Chapter 5. Congress Awakens. The United States Capitol stands with a quiet gravity at night, its white dome glowing softly against the dark Washington sky. By day, it is alive with voices, debates in marble halls, hurried footsteps on polished floors, the shuffle of papers carried to meetings. But in May of 2022, those halls bore witness to something unusual. For the first time in over 50 years, Congress held a public hearing on unidentified aerial phenomena. The hearing room itself was not extraordinary. Rows of seats, microphones on polished wooden desks, water pitchers sweating under the lights. Yet the atmosphere carried weight. Senators and representatives gathered not to discuss budgets or policies, but to ask questions about mysteries long confined to the shadows. At the center sat two men from the Department of Defense, charged with explaining what the government had been studying, what it had seen, and what it still did not understand. The tone was careful. Lawmakers spoke with measured words, avoiding speculation, but their questions revealed a quiet urgency. What were the objects captured on Navy video? Why did military pilots report encounters with craft that outperformed their own jets? Were these technologies foreign, or something else entirely? Each inquiry carried the sense that behind the calm language was a deeper recognition that the skies above were not as simple as once believed. For the officials at the witness table, the task was delicate. They were not there to fuel sensationalism. They were there to reassure, to inform, and to acknowledge the unexplained without straying beyond what evidence allowed. In their responses, words like anomalous and unidentified echoed repeatedly. They described new reporting systems designed to reduce stigma, procedures to catalog encounters, and the ongoing efforts of the newly established All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. But when pressed about the most extraordinary cases, their language grew cautious. Some things, they admitted, remained unexplained. The hearing was quiet by the standards of Congress. There were no heated arguments, no shouting matches. Instead, there was a sense of curiosity wrapped in restraint, as though both lawmakers and witnesses were walking a line, acknowledging the mystery without losing their balance. For those listening, the moment carried a weight far beyond the words themselves. It was the symbolism that mattered. After decades of silence, the nation's highest legislative body was asking questions in public view. Outside the hearing room, journalists filled the hallways, notebooks in hand, cameras waiting. Headlines soon carried the news: Congress holds hearing on UFOs. The phrasing had changed, of course. The term was no longer UFO but UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena, chosen for its neutrality, its ability to shed the baggage of decades of ridicule. Yet for ordinary citizens, the meaning was clear. The government was finally talking, openly, about the unexplained. For witnesses like Ryan Graves and David Fravor, who later testified in additional settings, the hearing validated years of silence and frustration. No longer dismissed, their accounts now formed part of the official record. For the public, the hearings were both strange and reassuring. Strange because what had once been the subject of late-night television was now discussed in the solemn halls of government. Reassuring because the tone was calm, careful, and serious. This was not science fiction. This was national security, addressed with the same gravity as any other pressing issue. Imagine sitting in that room. The air is cool, the hum of cameras steady, the murmur of staffers, a low background rhythm. Senators lean forward, their questions steady, their faces thoughtful. On the screen behind them, grainy clips of objects darting across radar and infrared displays flicker briefly. In the silence that follows, one realizes the enormity of what is being said, not in shouts or proclamations, but in quiet acknowledgement. The unknown exists, and it is now part of the national conversation. The 2022 hearings did not provide definitive answers. They were not meant to, but they marked a shift, the moment when Congress itself became a stage for the mystery. The wall of silence, so carefully maintained for decades, had cracked not only in the Pentagon, but in the very heart of democratic debate. The questions had crossed from rumor into record, and in doing so, they had changed the landscape of disclosure forever. Words carry weight. In government, in science, in everyday conversation, the language chosen to describe a mystery can shape how it is perceived. For decades, the word UFO had been burdened with connotations, images of saucers in comic books, jokes in late-night monologues, stories of abductions that blurred the line between fact and fantasy. To call something a UFO was, in many circles, to risk not being taken seriously. It was a term that invited ridicule, a shorthand for eccentricity, rather than a symbol of disciplined inquiry. And so, when officials within the Pentagon and Congress began to shift their language, the change was more than cosmetic. Unidentified aerial phenomena, UAP, became the new phrase of choice. The word was precise, clinical, and free from the baggage that had weighed down UFO. It sounded less like science fiction and more like the kind of terminology found in intelligence briefings and technical reports. The transformation of language was deliberate. Within congressional hearings and Pentagon documents, officials made clear that this was not about chasing stories of aliens, nor indulging in popular culture. It was about aviation safety, national security, and the careful cataloging of events that defied easy explanation. By choosing UAP, they reframed the subject, not as a fringe obsession, but as a matter worthy of sober discussion. The new terminology also opened doors for witnesses. Pilots who once hesitated to report encounters now felt more comfortable describing them under the neutral banner of UAP. The word carried less stigma. It allowed testimony to flow into official channels without the instant skepticism that so often accompanied the older term. In this way, language did not merely describe the phenomenon, it reshaped the culture around it. The shift echoed beyond government halls. Journalists, too, adopted the new terminology, writing headlines that spoke of UAPs with an air of seriousness once absent from UFO coverage. Scientists, previously wary of association with a term steeped in pop culture, found more freedom to engage. Universities began to discuss UAPs in seminars, not as curiosities, but as data points, subjects of study like any other. The new phrase created space for curiosity to exist without fear of mockery. Still, the echoes of the old word remained. For many in the public, UFO carried a certain familiarity, a cultural shorthand that UAP lacked, but the careful rebranding was working. In hearings, senators spoke of UAPs with the same cadence they might use when discussing radar systems or satellite imagery. The phrase settled into the lexicon of officialdom, smoothing away the jagged edges of ridicule that had clung to the topic for so long. Consider the symbolism of a senator seated in a hearing room, leaning toward a microphone and saying not flying saucer, but unidentified aerial phenomenon. The words land differently. They invite thought rather than laughter. They open the door for follow-up questions about radar data, about flight safety, about intelligence sharing with allies. The subject is the same, but the language has changed the terrain on which the conversation takes place. This was not the first time governments had attempted such shifts. In earlier decades, terms like unidentified flying object were themselves meant to strip away sensationalism, but over time, even that phrase acquired cultural weight. Now with UAP, the process began again. The hope was that this term, grounded in neutrality, could withstand the pull of myth and remain anchored in the language of study. The impact was subtle yet profound. By renaming the phenomenon, Congress and the Pentagon acknowledged not only the mystery in the skies, but also the history of silence and stigma on the ground. They admitted, in effect, that part of the challenge lay not in the objects themselves, but in the way they had been spoken of. Changing the language was a way of clearing the path, removing obstacles of laughter and doubt, so that the conversation could finally move forward. Imagine hearing the word UAP for the first time in a public broadcast. It sounds new, careful, official. It lacks the cultural baggage of decades, yet it carries with it the same sense of wonder. Something is out there, moving in ways not yet understood. The sky has not changed, but the words we use to describe it have, and with that change, the possibility of disclosure begins to feel less like a distant dream and more like a quiet unfolding reality. Public hearings offer a glimpse of transparency, but much of Congress's true work happens beyond the cameras in private sessions, classified briefings, and quiet conversations in offices lined with thick carpets and framed portraits. When it came to UAPs, the hearings of 2022 and beyond marked a turning point, but they were only the surface. Behind closed doors, lawmakers and defense officials spoke in tones far more candid than those heard on record. The questions were sharper in those private rooms. If unidentified objects were intruding into restricted airspace, what did that mean for the safety of pilots and the security of the nation? Were adversaries testing technologies beyond American understanding? Could these objects represent surveillance platforms, weapons, or something more elusive? Each question cut deeper than the carefully measured words spoken in public. National security was the lens through which most lawmakers viewed the issue. The extraordinary possibilities, the whispers of extraterrestrial origins, remained largely unspoken in official settings. Instead, the focus was practical: defense, readiness, risk. If the objects were drones, whose drones were they? If they were experimental aircraft, why did they appear in training zones, skimming coasts, and shadowing fleets? If they were not ours and not theirs, then what? The last question often hung in the air, suspended like the very phenomena it described, acknowledged silently but rarely spoken aloud. Intelligence officers presented data in classified settings. Radar returns, satellite imagery, and pilot debriefs were reviewed in detail, stripped of the cautious euphemisms used in public. Senators listened, brows furrowed, weighing not only the strangeness of the reports, but their implications. America prided itself on controlling its skies. The possibility that it did not, that something unknown moved freely above, carried a weight heavier than curiosity. It carried the potential for vulnerability. Some lawmakers left these sessions unsettled. They were accustomed to debating budgets, weapons systems, and troop deployments, matters that, however complex, rested on known realities. UAPs resisted that comfort. They were phenomena without clear origin, without identifiable intent. To a legislator tasked with ensuring the security of the nation, that uncertainty was unnerving. The whispers extended beyond Congress. In think tanks, intelligence agencies, and defense contractors, discussions about UAPs began to surface in quiet corners. Engineers speculated on propulsion systems, analysts reviewed patterns of sightings, and military planners asked themselves how to defend against an unknown that could accelerate instantly or vanish without a trace. Each conversation carried the same undercurrent, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a gap, an absence of understanding in a domain where understanding was supposed to be absolute. Yet even in these closed rooms, restraint held firm. Officials avoided sensational conclusions. They reminded each other of the need for caution, of the dangers of leaping to extraordinary assumptions. Still, the unease was undeniable. Some encounters involved objects hovering near nuclear facilities. Others showed them shadowing carrier groups. These were not distant curiosities. They were intrusions into areas of highest strategic importance. Imagine a secure briefing room deep within the Capitol complex. The walls are thick, the doors guarded, cell phones left outside. At the long table, lawmakers sit with folders of classified reports. A defense official clicks through slides, radar plots, timelines of sightings, photographs blurred but suggestive. The room is quiet except for the steady rhythm of the briefing. Questions arise, cautious at first, then more pointed. If these are adversary technologies, how did they get so far ahead? If they are not adversary, then what are they? No easy answers follow, only silence, and the weight of mystery pressing against the edges of security itself. In public, the hearing spoke of transparency, of safety, of scientific curiosity. In private, the language grew heavier. The unknown was no longer a distant story. It was a present concern. National security, the cornerstone of congressional duty, was now intertwined with a mystery older than the Cold War and more stubborn than secrecy itself. And so behind the scenes the whispers grew. Quiet conversations carried the same refrain. Something is in our skies, and we do not know what it is. For a government built on certainty, that was perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. Chapter 6. The Pentagon Speaks. In June of 2021, after years of mounting testimony and the public release of Navy footage, the Pentagon delivered something long anticipated, an official report on unidentified aerial phenomena. For decades, such documents had either been buried, redacted into near silence, or crafted with dismissive tones. This one was different. It did not arrive as rumor, nor as a leak, but as an official product of government, requested by Congress, prepared by intelligence agencies, and released for the world to read. The report was brief, barely 9 pages in length, but within its measured language lay significance. It cataloged 144 incidents involving UAPs, drawn from reports made between 2004 and 2021. These were not anecdotes from farmers or travelers on lonely roads. They were encounters logged by military pilots, recorded by advanced radar systems, and reviewed by intelligence officers tasked with protecting the nation. The tone was clinical, restrained, yet for those who had followed the subject, the implications were profound. Of the 144 cases, the report stated only one could be explained with confidence. It was identified as a balloon, mundane, unremarkable, comfortably within the bounds of ordinary explanation. The other 143 remained unresolved. They were not proven to be extraordinary, but neither could they be dismissed. They were, in the careful phrasing of the report, unexplained. What made the report striking was not just the number of cases, but the acknowledgement of their persistence. These were not one-off anomalies, nor the result of a single faulty system. The encounters spanned years, locations, and technologies. They involved multiple witnesses, corroborating data, and observations from different angles. In some instances, objects were seen visually, tracked on radar, and recorded on infrared all at once. Such convergence made dismissal harder than ever. The language of the report reflected a balance between caution and recognition. It did not leap to conclusions, did not suggest extraterrestrial origins, did not offer sensational claims. Instead, it framed the phenomenon as a matter of aviation safety and national security. Pilots had encountered objects that risked collision. Naval exercises had been disrupted by intrusions. Airspace considered secure had been penetrated by unknown craft. These facts, the report implied, warranted attention regardless of what the objects ultimately proved to be. For those who had carried stories of encounters for years, the report was a kind of validation. The very act of cataloging these cases under the banner of official acknowledgement marked a departure from decades of dismissal. The pilots who once feared ridicule now saw their experiences preserved in the pages of a government document. The radar operators who hesitated to speak found their data reflected in quiet charts and categories. What had been whispers in briefing rooms now existed in the language of record. Yet the brevity of the report also left questions unanswered. What patterns did the 143 unexplained cases share? How many involved accelerations beyond known technology? How many hovered silently, rotated against the wind, or vanished from sensors in an instant? The report offered categories, but withheld details. It admitted mystery, but not in a way that satisfied curiosity. Imagine the setting in which the report was drafted. Analysts seated in quiet offices, stacks of files spread across tables, screens replaying footage of distant shapes darting across radar. Each case weighed, each data point considered, yet always under the constraint of time, classification, and the need to avoid speculation. The final product was slim, its words chosen with precision, as though each sentence had been weighed against both truth and perception. For the public, the report was both revelatory and restrained. It confirmed what many had long suspected, that unexplained objects were being encountered with regularity by the most advanced military in the world. But it also avoided conclusions, leaving the mystery intact. The silence of decades had not been broken with a dramatic revelation. It had been eased open, carefully, with the cautious language of analysts who acknowledged only what they could not deny. The number lingered, 143 unexplained cases, not proof, not disclosure in the fullest sense, but a foothold, a reminder that mystery, when carried by credible witnesses and confirmed by technology, could no longer be ignored. When the Pentagon's preliminary UAP report was released in 2021, its most striking feature was not only the number of unexplained encounters, but the way they were classified. To organize the 144 cases reviewed, analysts devised 5 broad categories, 5 boxes into which every sighting might eventually fit. The language was measured, clinical, and deliberately unsensational. Yet within those categories lay the quiet acknowledgement that not everything observed in the skies could be explained. The first box was airborne clutter. This included birds, balloons, recreational drones, plastic bags, or even airborne debris caught in winds aloft. These were the simplest explanations, the kinds of answers that most comfortably fit within ordinary experience. Pilots and radar operators were familiar with clutter, and analysts knew that such objects could occasionally mimic the signatures of something extraordinary. A misidentified balloon at high altitude could appear unusual on radar. A plastic bag carried by strong winds could look strange against a pale horizon. The inclusion of this category reminded readers that not all mysteries are profound, some are mundane. The second category was natural atmospheric phenomena. Here the report listed things like ice crystals, moisture, or thermal fluctuations, conditions that can produce reflections, distortions, or mirages. For decades, skeptics had pointed to temperature inversions, lightning sprites, and other atmospheric oddities as explanations for UFO sightings. While such phenomena could account for some encounters, the report did not claim they explained all. They remained a piece of the puzzle, capable of answering certain cases, but inadequate for the most extraordinary ones. The third box was more unsettling: foreign adversary systems. Analysts acknowledged the possibility that some sightings might represent advanced technologies developed by rival nations, platforms unknown to the United States, but capable of extraordinary performance. In the context of modern geopolitics, this category carried weight. If another country had achieved breakthroughs in propulsion, stealth, or hypersonic flight, the balance of power could be altered dramatically. For lawmakers reading the report, this possibility was sobering. It framed UAPs not only as curiosities, but as potential threats, demanding vigilance. The fourth category was U.S. government or industry developmental programs. In other words, secret projects. The Pentagon admitted that some UAPs might be advanced aircraft or drones tested under classified programs, unknown even to the pilots who encountered them. This possibility was not surprising. History had shown that stealth aircraft, spy planes, and experimental platforms often flew under layers of secrecy, yet the report offered no evidence that the unexplained cases were simply black projects. It left the possibility open but unresolved, acknowledging the limits of compartmentalization even within the U.S. defense establishment. Finally, there was the fifth box: other. Here the report placed encounters that could not be explained by clutter, weather, foreign technology, or secret programs. These were the anomalies that defied categorization, the objects that hovered motionless in high winds, that accelerated instantly without visible propulsion, that slipped effortlessly between altitudes. The report did not speculate about what other meant. It offered no theories, no leaps into the extraordinary. It simply left the category open, a quiet admission that some phenomena did not fit anywhere else. This structure was both cautious and revealing. By presenting categories, the Pentagon demonstrated that it was approaching the subject with analytical discipline. Each case would be tested against the most plausible explanations first, yet the very existence of the other category was itself remarkable. It acknowledged that after eliminating debris, weather, foreign rivals, and classified projects, something remained. That remainder, however undefined, was preserved in official language. For pilots and witnesses, the categories were less important than the experiences themselves. A pilot who nearly collided with a cube-shaped object hovering inside a transparent sphere was not comforted by knowing it might someday be filed under other. A radar operator who tracked objects plunging from high altitude to sea level in seconds found little reassurance in categories. Yet the framework offered something else: legitimacy. It was proof that the government was no longer laughing, no longer dismissing. The mystery was being studied, even if the answers remained elusive. Imagine reading the report late at night. The words are plain, bureaucratic, stripped of drama. Yet as your eyes move down the page, the categories unfold like a quiet confession: clutter, weather, foreign rivals, secret projects, other. The last word lingers longest, as though it were a doorway left slightly ajar, not explained, not dismissed, simply admitted into the record. In that single word, other, lies the quiet echo of decades of secrecy, the acknowledgement that mystery remains. And for the first time in years, the Pentagon had written it down. The most striking sentence in the Pentagon's 2021 preliminary assessment was also the simplest: some remain unexplained. Those three words carried more weight than pages of technical jargon. For decades, official voices had insisted that nothing extraordinary was happening in the skies, that every sighting could be chalked up to balloons, birds, or human error. Now, within an official government report, the silence had shifted. The acknowledgement was not shouted, not emphasized with bold print. It was nestled within cautious paragraphs, surrounded by words of restraint. But it was there, a quiet admission that not everything could be explained away. For pilots and witnesses, those words were vindication. Imagine being an aviator who had chased a white capsule across the Pacific sky, only to return to debriefings where eyebrows were raised and explanations offered that rang hollow. Imagine being a radar operator who had tracked objects plunging from 60,000 feet to sea level in seconds, only to be told it must have been a glitch. For those individuals, the phrase "some remain unexplained" was more than a line in a report. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that their experiences had not been illusions. The language of the report was cautious for a reason. Officials knew that speculation could ignite headlines far beyond what evidence supported. They avoided words like alien or extraterrestrial. They avoided dramatic claims. Instead, they presented the facts as they stood: 144 encounters, most unresolved, and a handful displaying characteristics that defied known technology. The admission was not about providing answers. It was about allowing the question to exist in public view. This subtle shift marked a turning point. For years, the burden of proof rested on witnesses who had to defend themselves against ridicule. Now the burden began to tilt. The Pentagon itself had acknowledged that some cases resisted explanation. The mystery was no longer carried solely by farmers, police officers, or curious citizens. It was carried by the Department of Defense. The implications stretched beyond national security. Scientists too began to take notice. If the Pentagon admitted that some encounters remained unexplained, then surely the phenomena warranted study. Astrophysicists, engineers, and data analysts quietly began to explore possibilities, framing the mystery not as fantasy, but as a frontier for inquiry. Universities hosted seminars, research groups formed. The subject edged closer to legitimacy, yet the admission also deepened unease. If some encounters remained unexplained, what did that mean for aviation safety? What did it mean for the ability of the most powerful military on Earth to control its airspace? The report did not offer comfort. It did not suggest that the unexplained were harmless, only that they were real. For lawmakers, this was enough to press for further investigation. For the public, it was enough to spark both wonder and worry. Consider the atmosphere in which those words were drafted. Analysts seated in secure offices, reviewing data streams from pilots and ships, knew the stakes of every sentence. To admit too much could trigger speculation beyond control. To say too little would render the report meaningless. And so they chose a balance. They wrote plainly, "Some cases remain unexplained." It was the most honest phrase they could use without stepping into the realm of conclusion. Imagine reading those words in the quiet of night. The room is still, the report resting in your hands, its pages filled with careful phrasing. Then your eyes pause on the sentence, "Some remain unexplained." The simplicity of it stirs something deeper than the most elaborate explanation, because in that simplicity lies the acknowledgement of mystery, not dismissed, not ridiculed, but written into the record of a government that had spent decades insisting otherwise. The admission did not solve the puzzle. It did not reveal origins or intentions, but it shifted the conversation. Mystery was no longer outside the walls of officialdom. It was inside, documented, cataloged, and recognized. And in that recognition, the silence of decades began to give way to something new, a cautious, quiet voice admitting that humanity does not yet understand everything that shares its skies. Chapter 7: AARO Scientific Mission. In the wake of the Pentagon's preliminary UAP report, Congress pressed for more than acknowledgement. It wanted structure. It wanted an office tasked not just with cataloging mysteries, but with investigating them systematically, scientifically, and across domains. Out of that demand, in July 2022, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was established. Known by its acronym, AARO, the new office represented a shift from scattered study to a dedicated mission. The choice of name was deliberate. Not UAP Office, not UFO Desk, but All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. The phrasing carried the weight of bureaucratic caution. It signaled that the work would not be limited to objects in the sky, but would encompass anomalies across air, sea, and even space. It also avoided the cultural baggage of older terms, grounding the mission in the neutral, clinical language of science and intelligence. The office was placed under the Department of Defense, with a mandate that stretched across agencies. Its purpose was to synchronize efforts, drawing together data from the Navy, the Air Force, intelligence services, and even civilian reports. For the first time in decades, the investigation of unexplained aerial phenomena was not relegated to a corner program hidden in a black budget. It was official, structured, and openly acknowledged. At its head was Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick, a physicist with long experience in defense intelligence. Calm, thoughtful, and precise, Kirkpatrick embodied the scientific approach Congress hoped the office would bring. His task was daunting. The office was expected to receive and evaluate new reports, investigate historical cases, and develop methods to analyze sightings in ways that could withstand scrutiny. More than that, AARO was expected to bridge the gap between secrecy and transparency, protecting national security while providing the public with updates. The creation of AARO signaled more than an organizational change. It marked a philosophical shift. For decades, the study of UFOs had oscillated between denial and speculation. Now the government was framing the mystery as a problem of data and science. It was not about belief, not about stories, but about analysis. Objects appeared in restricted airspace. What sensors recorded them? What patterns did the data reveal? Could their movements be modeled, compared, explained? These were the kinds of questions AARO was designed to ask. Still, the office was not born into clarity. The mystery of UAPs remained as thick as ever, and the data it inherited was messy, incomplete, and often fragmented. Some reports contained precise radar tracks and multiple witnesses. Others were brief notations, vague and difficult to interpret. Sorting through decades of encounters was like sifting through sand for rare shells. Most grains were ordinary, but a few carried unusual shapes that refused to fit known categories. For Kirkpatrick and his team, the challenge was not only technical, but cultural. The stigma that had long surrounded the subject still lingered. Pilots worried about reputation. Officers hesitated to report anomalies. Part of AARO's mission then was to change the culture, to normalize reporting, to encourage professionals to speak without fear of mockery. Only with a steady flow of data could the mystery be studied with seriousness. Imagine the office in its earliest days, a quiet suite in a government building, walls lined with maps, screens glowing with radar plots, analysts hunched over keyboards. On one desk, a folder containing declassified cases from decades past. On another, a real-time feed of incoming reports. The atmosphere is not dramatic, but steady. Scientists and intelligence officers working side by side, treating the unexplained not as fantasy, but as a problem to be solved. For the public, the creation of AARO was both reassuring and intriguing. It suggested that the government was finally treating the subject with seriousness, that resources were being committed to the study of what had long been dismissed. Yet it also deepened the sense of mystery. If a new office was needed, what did that say about the scale of the phenomenon? In its name, in its mission, in its very existence, AARO symbolized a new phase of disclosure, a recognition that the unknown was not going away, and that silence was no longer enough. Science and mystery were now bound together, written into the charter of a Pentagon office. The journey had entered a new chapter. When AARO was established, one of its first tasks was deceptively simple: to gather everything. Reports from pilots, radar logs, sensor recordings, archival files, every fragment of data scattered across decades and agencies needed to be pulled together into one place. It was a monumental undertaking. For years, information about unexplained phenomena had been filed away in disconnected silos, some in Navy archives, some in Air Force records, some in the vaults of intelligence agencies. Even civilian reports existed in separate databases, maintained by researchers outside government circles. To bring order to such a patchwork was a task of patience and persistence. The chaos of the data reflected the chaos of the phenomenon itself. Some reports were precise, exact times, coordinates, altitudes, speeds. Others were vague, nothing more than a line or two describing a strange light in the sky. Some contained multiple sources of confirmation: radar, infrared, visual observation. Others relied on a single witness. To make sense of it all, AARO needed not just storage, but methodology. So the office began building databases designed to categorize and compare. Each report was logged with key details: date, location, environmental conditions, type of observation, number of witnesses, and supporting data. By creating a consistent framework, analysts could search for patterns across time and space. Were certain regions more active than others? Did sightings increase during particular seasons or during military exercises? Did objects share similar shapes, behaviors, or accelerations? Questions that had once been asked anecdotally could now be explored systematically. The work required more than clerical effort. It required judgment, deciding how much weight to give each kind of evidence, how to account for the limits of human perception, how to separate noise from signal. A glowing object glimpsed briefly by a single observer might be filed as low confidence. A structured craft tracked on multiple radar systems and confirmed by pilots could be flagged for deeper study. Bit by bit, the database began to take shape, transforming scattered stories into structured information. From this growing archive, patterns slowly emerged. Some cases clustered around military training ranges, where advanced sensors and vigilant pilots were most often present. Others appeared near coastlines, where the boundary between sea and sky blurred and where naval operations frequently unfolded. Shapes repeated, spheres, disks, and capsules described again and again across years and continents. Behaviors repeated too, sudden accelerations, silent hovering, vanishing from sensors in an instant. The similarities, noted carefully in spreadsheets and charts, suggested a phenomenon that was not random but consistent. To explore further, AARO turned to science. Physicists, engineers, and data specialists were asked to review the most compelling cases. Equations were applied to radar tracks, calculating velocities and accelerations. Infrared signatures were analyzed to estimate heat output or the lack of it. Meteorological data was cross-checked to rule out atmospheric illusions. The work was slow, deliberate, sometimes frustrating. Many cases dissolved under scrutiny into ordinary explanations: drones, balloons, reflections. But a stubborn core remained, cases that resisted every conventional model. For the analysts, this was both unsettling and motivating. To be faced with the unknown is not unusual in science. Mysteries are the fuel of discovery. But to face mysteries that appear again and again across different sensors, witnesses, and decades is something else. It suggests a pattern beneath the noise, a signal woven into the fabric of experience. Imagine a quiet AARO office late in the evening. A researcher sits before a glowing screen, scrolling through reports. One entry describes a glowing orb tracked near a naval destroyer. Another, decades earlier, recounts a similar orb near a missile site thousands of miles away. The language differs, the details vary, but the essence is the same. The analyst pauses, highlighting the entries, linking them in the database. A line appears on the screen, connecting moments across time and geography. What was once isolated begins to look like part of a larger story. For the public, these efforts were invisible, hidden behind the walls of classification and bureaucracy. But within AARO, the slow work of order was transforming chaos into clarity. Not clarity in the sense of final answers, but clarity in patterns, evidence that the mystery was not random, not fleeting, but woven into human observation across generations. In that realization lay a quiet revelation. Whatever UAPs might be, foreign technology, misunderstood phenomena, or something else entirely, they were not isolated curiosities. They were persistent, recurring, and consistent enough to leave their fingerprints across databases that now stretched back decades. The mystery, once scattered, was being bound together into something coherent, and in that coherence, the weight of silence began to give way to the possibility of understanding. The creation of the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office was, in itself, an act of transparency. For decades, the very existence of programs studying unidentified phenomena had been hidden, buried in obscure budgets, or quietly disbanded when attention grew too intense. Now, a Pentagon office carried the mission openly, its name published, its mandate announced. Yet from the beginning, AARO faced a paradox. To serve its purpose, it had to balance two opposing forces: the demand for transparency from the public and Congress, and the need for secrecy inherent in national defense. On one side was the public's growing appetite for answers. Citizens who had followed the Navy videos, the congressional hearings, and the Pentagon's preliminary report wanted more. They wanted details, flight paths, sensor data, photographs, conclusions. For many, the subject was not simply about security. It was about humanity's place in the universe. Each press release or public briefing carried with it the hope of revelation. On the other side was the reality of classified information. Much of the data AARO received came from advanced military systems, radars, satellites, sensors whose capabilities were themselves closely guarded secrets. To release raw data was to risk exposing how those systems worked, what they could detect, and where their limits lay. In matters of defense, such exposure could be dangerous, revealing too much to potential adversaries. And so the office walked carefully, weighing what could be shared without compromising national security. The result was a kind of careful choreography. In public reports, AARO acknowledged the phenomenon, summarized numbers, and described categories. It spoke of databases, methodologies, and the persistence of unexplained encounters. But the details remained behind closed doors. Specific speeds, altitudes, and sensor signatures were withheld. The most compelling cases were studied in classified settings, accessible only to those with the right clearance. To outsiders, this felt like half measures, transparency tempered by shadow. For lawmakers, the balance was frustrating, but understandable. Members of Congress pressed for open hearings, but they also attended classified briefings where details flowed more freely. They emerged from those sessions with carefully chosen words, acknowledging that some phenomena remained unexplained, but avoiding conclusions that could not be proven. The dual structure of disclosure, public acknowledgement paired with private detail, became the rhythm of the new era. For the analysts within AARO, the balance was personal as well as professional. They worked in offices where scientific curiosity pressed constantly against the constraints of classification. A researcher might uncover a striking pattern, connecting cases across decades, only to realize that the findings could not be shared openly. The frustration was real, but so too was the sense of purpose. Even if the public could not see every detail, the very act of study represented progress after decades of silence. The cultural stigma surrounding UAPs added another layer of complexity. By speaking publicly, AARO sought to normalize the subject, to remove ridicule from the conversation. Each briefing was crafted with care, avoiding the language of sensationalism. The goal was not to fuel speculation, but to establish credibility. Transparency, in this sense, was less about dramatic revelations and more about building trust, a slow process of showing that the mystery was being treated with seriousness. Imagine the delicate scene of a public briefing. Reporters gather, notebooks in hand, cameras trained on a podium. AARO officials step forward, their statements measured, their tones steady. They describe progress, hundreds of reports cataloged, patterns analyzed, investigations ongoing. They acknowledge that some cases remain unexplained, and then they stop, declining to provide details that might reveal too much. The room hums with quiet frustration, but also with recognition. The wall of silence has cracked, even if it has not fully fallen. This balance between what is said and what is withheld defines the era of AARO. Too much secrecy, and old suspicions return, whispering of cover-ups. Too much openness, and national security is compromised. Between those extremes lies the narrow path the office must walk, step by careful step. For the public, the effect is both satisfying and unsatisfying. The mystery has been admitted, but not solved. The unknown has been acknowledged, but not explained. Yet in this careful balance lies something extraordinary. For the first time in generations, the government is no longer ridiculing, no longer denying. It is speaking, cautiously and carefully, of mysteries that remain. And for those who listen closely, that alone is a profound change. Chapter 8. Global Echoes of Disclosure. The skies are not bounded by borders. Clouds drift across nations. Winds sweep from one coast to another, and the mysteries that appear above one land often pass silently into the airspace of another. For this reason, the story of unidentified aerial phenomena has never belonged to one country alone. And while the Pentagon's admissions in recent years have drawn the world's attention, other nations have long pursued their own paths of investigation. France was among the first to treat the subject with unusual seriousness. In 1977, the French space agency CNES established GPAN, the Group for the Study and Information on Unidentified Aerospace Phenomena. Unlike the secretive programs of the United States, GPAN was deliberately public. Its mandate was not only to investigate reports, but also to inform citizens, publishing findings openly on its website. In time, thousands of cases were archived, ranging from fleeting lights mistaken for stars to encounters that defied easy explanation. The French approach was distinctive in its transparency. Witnesses, pilots, police officers, civilians could report what they had seen without fear of ridicule. Their accounts were logged, cross-checked, and categorized. Some were quickly explained as satellites, weather phenomena, or aircraft. Others resisted categorization and were labeled Pan-D phenomena, not explained despite thorough investigation. These unexplained cases remained small in number, but carried significant weight, a quiet reminder that even with disciplined study, the mystery endured. Across the Channel, the United Kingdom also opened its archives. For years, the Ministry of Defense had quietly collected UFO reports, studied sightings near military bases, and filed them away in classified drawers. By the early 2000s, however, public pressure for transparency grew. In response, the government began releasing files through the National Archives. Decades of reports became available. Letters from citizens describing lights over rural towns, debriefings of pilots startled by objects on radar, and analyses written in the dry language of civil servants. The UK files revealed not only encounters, but also the attitudes of officials. Again and again, the documents showed a preference for reassurance. Most sightings were explained as misidentified aircraft or natural phenomena. Yet scattered among the files were incidents that resisted explanation, cases where pilots had chased objects moving at impossible speeds, or where radar systems tracked craft that vanished without trace. In those moments, the British reports echoed the same caution heard in American files, a recognition of the unknown, carefully couched in understated tones. What distinguished both France and the UK was not the answers they provided, but the openness of their approach. By releasing files, they allowed citizens and researchers to see the process of investigation, the mundane explanations alongside the stubborn anomalies. This transparency did not resolve the mystery, but it shifted the relationship between governments and the public. Citizens could see that their reports were not simply ridiculed, they were logged, studied, and sometimes left unresolved. The global echoes of disclosure also carried cultural weight. When the Pentagon acknowledged UAPs, it did so in a world where France had already published thousands of files and Britain had released decades of reports. The United States was no longer speaking into silence. It was joining a conversation that other nations had been willing to have for years. Imagine walking through the National Archives in London, the hushed rooms lined with boxes and folders. Within one file, a letter from a school teacher in the 1980s describes a bright object hovering silently above a field. In another, a radar operator logs an encounter that lasted minutes, the traces sharp and undeniable. Now imagine opening Guy Epin's digital archive in Toulouse, scrolling through carefully categorized cases, each entry blending witness testimony with official notes. The words may differ, the languages may shift, but the essence remains the same, a record of human encounters with the unexplained. These archives, French and British alike, remind us that the phenomenon is not bounded by politics or language. It appears in skies above Europe as it does above America, above small villages as it does over vast oceans. Each report adds to the mosaic, a collective acknowledgement that the unknown is not confined to one nation's experience. For those listening tonight, the story of France and the UK offers a gentle lesson. Disclosure is not a single moment, not a dramatic unveiling. It is a process, unfolding across decades and borders, shaped by cultures and governments, each in their own way. And within that process lies something universal, the quiet human act of looking upward, seeing something strange, and whispering the same question asked across centuries: what is it? Far from Washington, across oceans and continents, other nations have faced the same quiet puzzle of objects in their skies. Some chose secrecy, filing reports away in classified cabinets. Others, however, moved toward transparency, offering glimpses of the mystery to their citizens. Among the most notable were Chile and Brazil, two countries whose approaches to UAPs revealed both courage and curiosity. In Chile, the responsibility fell to the CEFAA, the Committee for the Study of Anomalous Aerial Phenomena, established in 1997 under the Directorate General of Civil Aeronautics. CEFAA was created with a mission, much like France's GAIPAN, to investigate reports of unidentified aerial phenomena and share findings with the public. Its staff included military officials, scientists, and civilian experts, working together to evaluate encounters. The Chilean skies, vast and clear, often served as canvases for such mysteries. Pilots reported glowing objects that maneuvered with sudden precision, sometimes shadowing commercial flights. Radar operators described anomalies that appeared briefly, then vanished as though dissolving into the horizon. Some cases were explained: reflections, misidentified aircraft, satellites, but others lingered. CEFAA's approach was calm and deliberate. Reports were logged, witnesses interviewed, and when cases could not be explained, they were admitted as such. In this way, Chile became one of the few nations to treat the subject with both seriousness and openness, offering citizens not definitive answers, but a record of inquiry. Brazil's story was different, marked by dramatic events that became part of the nation's history. One of the most famous unfolded in 1986, when dozens of UFOs were tracked over São Paulo and other regions by both radar and visual observation. Brazilian Air Force jets were scrambled to intercept the unknown craft, and pilots described pursuing objects that accelerated suddenly, outran their jets, and vanished without trace. The incident made headlines, and for years the files remained classified. But in the 2000s, Brazil began to release portions of its UFO archives, acknowledging that the events of 1986 had indeed occurred and remained unexplained. Another moment came in 1977, during what became known as the Colares Flap in northern Brazil. Residents of the town of Colares reported strange lights in the sky, sometimes described as beams that left physical marks on the skin of witnesses. The Brazilian Air Force launched an investigation, codenamed Operation Saucer, sending teams to the region to document the events. Dozens of photographs, testimonies, and sketches were collected. For years, the files remained hidden. When they were finally declassified decades later, they revealed a striking blend of the ordinary and the extraordinary. Villagers describing encounters, military officers photographing luminous objects, analysts puzzling over what could be causing such persistent phenomena. What tied Chile and Brazil together was their willingness to admit uncertainty. Neither nation claimed to know what the objects were. Neither proclaimed conclusions beyond the evidence. Instead, they did what few governments dared. They acknowledged the unexplained openly, trusting their citizens with the knowledge that mystery still lingered in their skies. For the global community, these cases carried weight. They showed that the phenomenon was not limited to one region or one military. When Brazilian jets pursued objects in 1986, when Chilean pilots logged encounters with luminous craft, their experiences echoed the reports of American aviators over the Pacific or Atlantic. The details varied, but the essence was the same: structured craft, extraordinary maneuvers, silence in the skies. Imagine a small Chilean control tower, its windows glowing against the darkness of night. Inside, an air traffic controller watches a blip appear on radar, darting across the screen in ways no known aircraft could. He calls a pilot, who confirms a light dancing against the stars. Or picture a Brazilian pilot in 1986, his jet roaring across the night sky, instruments steady, eyes locked on a glowing object that suddenly surges ahead faster than anything he has ever seen. These moments, scattered across nations, connect through their shared sense of wonder. For Chile, for Brazil, for all who looked upward, the sky became a reminder that mystery is universal. The Pentagon's cautious admissions in the 21st century were not isolated. They were part of a chorus of voices stretching across borders. Each country whispered the same acknowledgement that the skies hold more than we can explain, and that the unknown belongs to all of us. When the Pentagon speaks, its words rarely stop at America's borders. They travel outward, carried through alliances, echoed in partner governments, and studied in intelligence circles around the world. Among the closest listeners are the nations of the Five Eyes Alliance: the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Bound together by decades of intelligence sharing, these countries have long shared signals, intercepts, and surveillance. And when the subject turns to unidentified aerial phenomena, the ripples move quickly through this network. For decades, cooperation among the Five Eyes was focused on traditional threats, rival militaries, espionage, terrorism. But when objects appeared in the skies that defied identification, they too entered the web of shared reporting. A sighting in Canadian airspace might be logged in systems accessible to US analysts. A radar return tracked in Australia could be compared to similar anomalies over the Pacific. Through these channels, the mystery of UAPs became not only an American issue, but a collective one. When the Pentagon's 2021 report admitted that some encounters remained unexplained, the acknowledgement did not stop at Washington. In Ottawa, Canberra, London, and Wellington, officials read the same words with equal interest. Each nation had its own history of sightings, its own archives of files once kept from the public. The US admission gave weight to those histories. encouraging partners to revisit cases that had long sat in dusty archives. Canada, for instance, has a long record of civilian and military encounters. Reports from pilots crossing the vast northern territories described glowing objects pacing their aircraft, sometimes tracked on radar, sometimes seen only by the human eye. In 2022, Canadian officials quietly confirmed that they too were working with the Pentagon to study UAPs, acknowledging that the skies above the Arctic, remote, sparsely populated, and strategically important, were not immune to the unexplained. Australia's history carried echoes as well. In the 1970s and 80s, the Royal Australian Air Force logged reports of luminous craft maneuvering over outback regions and coastal waters. Some files were released publicly, others remained classified. In recent years, journalists pressed officials for updates, citing the Pentagon's disclosures as justification. If the US was admitting mystery, why should Australia not do the same? The ripple moved outward, urging transparency. The United Kingdom, already accustomed to public interest in its declassified files, found itself revisiting questions too. Lawmakers asked whether cooperation with the US extended into UAP investigations. Defense officials offered careful answers, acknowledging intelligence sharing while avoiding specifics. The very fact that the subject was raised in Parliament showed how far the ripple had traveled, from classified Pentagon corridors to the open debates of allied legislatures. New Zealand, though smaller in scale, also carried its share of mysteries. Pilots flying over the South Pacific described lights maneuvering in patterns no ordinary aircraft could match. Civilian observers reported disks and orbs drifting above coastal waters. In 2010, New Zealand released thousands of pages of UFO files, some dating back to the 1950s. For years, they had been curiosities in archives. After the Pentagon's admissions, they gained renewed attention, seen now as part of a larger global story. The strength of the Five Eyes Alliance lies not only in shared intelligence, but in shared perspective. When one partner acknowledges a mystery, the others are compelled to take note. The Pentagon's careful phrasing, "some remain unexplained," echoed through the alliance, encouraging counterparts to consider what their own records revealed. Each nation knew that the skies above them, vast and open, carried the same potential for wonder. Imagine an intelligence analyst in London, reviewing a briefing note marked with the familiar classification stamps of the Alliance. It describes a US Navy encounter off the East Coast, radar data showing objects darting through restricted airspace. The analyst recalls a similar report from Royal Air Force archives decades earlier. Or picture a Canadian official in Ottawa reading the Pentagon's report late at night, the words 143 unexplained cases glowing on the page. Outside the office window, the northern sky stretches endless and silent, yet filled with possibilities. In this way, the Pentagon's cautious admissions became more than national policy. They became global ripples, resonating through trusted partnerships, encouraging others to speak, and reminding all who share the alliance that the mystery of the skies is not an isolated burden. It is a shared one, spread across nations bound by cooperation, curiosity, and the same endless heavens above. Chapter 9. Patterns Across Time and Space. When the Pentagon released its preliminary report in 2021, many readers focused on the number 143 unexplained encounters. But for those familiar with the deeper history of UAPs, the words on those pages carried echoes of older stories. It was not the first time credible witnesses had described extraordinary craft. The Pentagon's modern files seem to mirror patterns long established, connecting the present to a past filled with legendary cases. One of the most famous unfolded in Rendlesham Forest, England, in December 1980. U.S. Air Force personnel stationed at RAF Woodbridge reported strange lights in the forest just beyond the perimeter of the base. At first, some thought a plane had gone down, but when security officers approached, they found a glowing object hovering among the trees. It was triangular, metallic, with strange markings along its hull. When they drew near, the object lifted silently into the air and darted away at impossible speed. Over the next nights, the lights returned. A deputy base commander, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Holt, led a team into the forest and recorded his observations on tape. His voice, calm but astonished, described lights moving through the trees, beams shining down onto the ground, and an object that split into multiple glowing spheres. Radiation readings were taken at the site, showing elevated levels. Officially, the incident was explained away as misidentified stars or a lighthouse, but the testimonies of trained officers, preserved in transcripts and recordings, told a different story, one of structured craft and intelligent movement. Across the Atlantic, another legendary case emerged in Phoenix, Arizona, in March 1997. Thousands of residents looked up into the night sky and saw something vast passing overhead. Some described it as a series of lights in a V-shaped formation stretching across miles. Others insisted it was a single massive craft, blocking out the stars as it moved silently across the city. The sightings lasted for hours, witnessed by families in their backyards, police officers on patrol, and even the governor of Arizona himself. The official explanation was flares, military exercises dropping lights over a distant range. Yet witnesses insisted the flares came later, after the enormous silent formation had already passed. For many in Phoenix, the memory remained vivid, a sense of awe, silence, and something immense moving just above their heads. When the Pentagon cataloged modern encounters, craft rotating against the wind, objects hovering silently, accelerations beyond known propulsion, researchers could not help notice the parallels. The triangular craft of Rendlesham, the massive formation of Phoenix, the white capsules tracked by Navy pilots, all seem to belong to the same family of mystery. Different times, different places, yet the same core characteristics: silence, precision, and impossibilities woven into motion. The modern term UAP might be new, but the experiences were not. The patterns stretched backward through decades, suggesting continuity rather than isolated anomalies. What today's pilots saw on radar, yesterday's witnesses had seen with their own eyes. What Navy cameras captured in grainy black and white, villagers and soldiers once described in whispered testimonies. The Pentagon's files, far from standing apart, now formed part of a larger tapestry of mystery stretching across history. Imagine standing in Rendlesham Forest on a winter night. The pines are dark silhouettes against the stars, breath clouding in the cold air. Suddenly, a glow flickers between the trees, a shape metallic, angular, strange. Or picture the warm desert evening in Phoenix, neighbors gathered on porches, pointing upward as a vast V of lights glides silently across the sky. These moments, separated by continents and decades, live on in memory and in files, joined now by the Pentagon's careful admissions. For those who have long studied the phenomenon, the lesson is simple. The skies have been whispering the same story for generations. Only now, with official reports and congressional hearings, are we beginning to recognize the continuity. The modern disclosures, are not the beginning of the story. They are the latest chapter in a tale as old as wonder itself. As the Pentagon and researchers began to study UAP encounters more closely, a curious consistency emerged. Across decades, witnesses described the same handful of behaviors, movements, and capabilities that did not fit within the known laws of aviation. Analysts began to group these traits into what became known as the five observables, characteristics that appeared again and again, regardless of time, place, or witness. Together, they formed a pattern that linked modern Navy encounters to legendary cases like Rendlesham and Phoenix. The first observable is instantaneous acceleration. Again and again, pilots described objects that moved from a standstill to impossible speeds in the blink of an eye. Radar operators logged tracks where an object would hover motionless, then suddenly leap across the screen, covering miles in seconds. Human bodies could not survive such maneuvers. The G-forces would crush even the most advanced pilot, and yet the objects moved effortlessly, as though inertia did not apply. The second is hypersonic velocity without signatures. Known aircraft that fly at such speeds, Mach 5 or higher, leave clear traces, heat, sonic booms, shock waves. UAPs, however, often displayed hypersonic movements while remaining silent, invisible to heat sensors, and without the telltale ripples of turbulence. To witnesses, it was as if the object slipped through the air without disturbing it, gliding with a grace unknown to propulsion systems on Earth. The third observable is low observability. Many UAPs appeared suddenly, visible to some sensors, but not others, or seen by the human eye, yet absent from radar. At times they seemed to fade in and out, as though cloaked. For military planners accustomed to tracking every blip in the sky, this was deeply unsettling. An object that could appear at will, immune to conventional detection, represented not just mystery, but potential vulnerability. The fourth is transmedium travel. Reports described objects moving seamlessly between mediums, air to water, water to air, even into space. Navy pilots recounted encounters where glowing objects hovered above the waves, then plunged beneath the surface without splash, continuing their trajectory underwater. Sonar operators described fast-moving contacts that mirrored aerial sightings, hinting at craft able to operate across domains without pause. It was this very capability that inspired the name of the Pentagon's new office, the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Finally, there is hovering without means of lift. Helicopters hover by spinning blades, drones by whirring rotors, yet many UAPs were seen hanging motionless in the sky, silent, without wings or propellers, as if suspended by unseen forces. Witnesses described cubes inside translucent spheres, glowing orbs, or massive craft holding steady against high winds, unaffected by turbulence. The absence of visible propulsion made these encounters some of the most striking. Together, the five observables gave shape to the mystery. They provided a vocabulary that could be used across cases, linking testimonies from the deserts of Arizona to the forests of Suffolk, from the Pacific Fleet to the skies over Brazil. A Navy pilot describing a tic-tac accelerating instantly, a villager recalling a craft hovering silently, a radar operator watching a track dive into the sea. All were speaking of the same traits, the same pattern repeated across generations. For analysts, this consistency was perhaps the most remarkable feature of the phenomenon. Human imagination might conjure countless shapes and movements, but reality, recorded again and again, seemed to narrow the possibilities. The same behaviors appeared in the 1950s as in the 2000s, suggesting that whatever the phenomenon was, it had not changed. The mystery was not evolving like human technology. It was steady, persistent, timeless. Imagine standing on the deck of a naval vessel at dusk, the ocean stretching out in calm waves. Suddenly, a light appears above the horizon, hovering in silence. Then, in a blink, it darts upward, vanishing into the sky faster than thought. Or picture a radar screen glowing softly in a control room, a blip moving across it at speeds that no jet could sustain, yet no sonic boom shakes the air outside. These moments, scattered across time, embody the five observables, the fingerprints of a phenomenon that refuses to conform to known laws. For decades, governments tried to explain these traits away, to fold them into the ordinary, but the five observables persisted, stubborn and undeniable, crossing continents and generations. In their quiet consistency, they whispered of something greater than error, something more than illusion. They whispered of a mystery, written not in isolated events, but in patterns woven across time and space. When analysts speak of UAPs today, they often point to the strangeness of modern encounters. The tic-tac objects tracked off the Pacific, the rotating craft in the gimbal video, the fast-moving spheres observed in the Atlantic. Yet for those who look more closely at the historical record, the most striking element is not novelty. It is consistency. The shapes, the motions, the behaviors described in the 21st century echo the testimonies of decades past. The mystery has not evolved like human technology. It has remained hauntingly familiar, as though following its own rhythm, untouched by time. Witnesses from the 1940s described discs that hovered silently, then darted away with impossible acceleration. Pilots in the 1950s spoke of glowing orbs pacing their aircraft, shifting direction with sudden, sharp turns. Soldiers in the 1960s recalled triangular craft hanging above fields, silent against the night. Civilians in the 1970s and 1980s recounted massive formations of lights moving slowly, deliberately, across skies that should have been empty. And in the 1990s, events like the Phoenix Lights drew entire cities into shared wonder. Thousands of voices describing the same immense silent passage overhead. Now, in the 2000s and 2010s, Navy pilots and radar operators report the very same patterns: hovering without propulsion, accelerations beyond endurance, shapes that seem simple, spheres, disks, capsules, yet behave with precision beyond known physics. The repetition is too steady to ignore. These are not scattered curiosities. They are persistent traits, observed again and again across continents and generations. The silence is part of the pattern too. Again and again, witnesses describe the absence of sound. Jets roar, helicopters thrum, rockets crack the air with thunder. But UAPs glide in silence, moving at hypersonic speeds, without sonic booms, hovering without engines, vanishing without a trace. For those who encounter them, the quiet is often the most unsettling feature. It is a silence that feels deliberate, as though woven into the essence of the phenomenon. The consistency also stretches across cultures. In France, in Brazil, in Japan, in the United States, witnesses describe the same shapes and motions. Farmers in rural towns use different words than naval aviators, but the essence matches. A glowing sphere seen in South America is no different from one tracked on radar near Virginia. A triangular craft observed in the forests of England mirrors shapes reported over deserts in the American Southwest. Across languages and borders, the same images appear. For scientists and analysts, this persistence raises questions. If the phenomenon were purely imagination, why would the stories remain so similar over so many years? Human technology has changed dramatically, from propeller planes to stealth bombers, from satellites to drones, yet the descriptions of UAPs have stayed constant. It suggests a continuity beyond coincidence, a thread of mystery weaving silently through the history of flight. Imagine standing in a field in the 1950s, gazing upward at a glowing disk hovering above. The air is still, the night alive with crickets. Then picture a Navy pilot in 2004, staring at a capsule-shaped craft through the canopy of his jet, the ocean stretching endless beneath him. Different times, different settings, yet the sensations align: awe, disbelief, and the quiet recognition that something has crossed into human space that does not belong to the ordinary. For governments, this consistency has been both a burden and a shield. The familiarity of the shapes and motions made the reports harder to dismiss, yet easier to categorize as repetition. Another flying saucer, another light in the sky. But beneath the bureaucratic language, the persistence could not be ignored. The Pentagon's modern files, when placed beside the testimonies of earlier decades, tell a story of continuity that no amount of ridicule can erase. And so, across the years, the same echoes return: shapes simple yet extraordinary, motions impossible yet undeniable, silence haunting yet unmistakable. The skies tell their story not in novelty, but in repetition. In that repetition lies the quiet suggestion that the mystery is not fleeting, not accidental. It is deliberate, enduring, and waiting still to be understood. Chapter 10. The Gentle Road Ahead. For most of the 20th century, the study of UFOs was pushed to the fringes. Scientists who took interest risked their reputations. Universities avoided the subject, fearing association with speculation or ridicule. The skies might have been full of mystery, but within academia silence ruled. That silence, however, has begun to soften with the Pentagon's admissions and Congress's hearings. A subtle shift has taken place. What was once taboo is slowly becoming a subject of legitimate inquiry. Laboratories, research groups, and universities, quietly, cautiously, are beginning to ask the questions long avoided. The shift is not dramatic. There are no banners announcing alien research, no grand declarations of discovery. Instead, it is a gentle normalization. In physics departments, graduate students model accelerations described by pilots, asking whether known equations could account for such movements. In aerospace labs, engineers run simulations of hypersonic flight without sonic booms, exploring whether new forms of propulsion might someday mimic what witnesses describe. In astronomy, researchers expand their search for technosignatures, subtle hints of technology beyond Earth, not only in the vastness of space, but perhaps closer to home. This quiet exploration is helped by the change in language. UAP carries none of the cultural baggage of UFO. Scientists can speak of anomalous aerial phenomena without conjuring images of little green men or flying saucers. The neutrality of the term creates space. Space for curiosity, space for conversation. For the first time in decades, serious researchers can consider the unexplained without risking immediate dismissal. Some of the work takes place under the banner of government contracts, supported by agencies that now recognize the need for deeper study. Others unfold in private research groups, funded by philanthropists or organizations drawn to the puzzle. And in a few laboratories, researchers pursue the questions quietly, without publicity, sharing their findings only with trusted colleagues. In each case, the approach is careful, methodical, free of sensational claims. Patterns are central to this new inquiry. Scientists examine databases compiled by AARO and other offices, searching for statistical consistencies. Do sightings cluster near certain altitudes, certain latitudes, or during particular weather conditions? Do shapes repeat more often than chance would suggest? Does the timing of events reveal cycles, as though the mystery moves according to its own clock? These are the kinds of questions that turn scattered encounters into data worthy of study. The inquiries reach into physics as well. Could propulsion be achieved without visible exhaust? Could craft move without interacting with air in the expected ways? Could inertia be cancelled or redirected, allowing for accelerations that would otherwise be lethal? These questions remain speculative, but they are no longer unaskable. They are part of the landscape of possibility, worthy of exploration in simulation and theory. Imagine a quiet laboratory at dusk. The hum of machines fades as researchers pack away their notes. On a computer screen, a simulation runs, an object darting across a digital sky, accelerating instantly, just as pilots described. Equations scroll across the monitor, their variables adjusted again and again, as if searching for the hidden key. Outside the window, the evening sky glows in fading light, and for a moment, one of the researchers glances upward, wondering if somewhere, beyond the clouds, the very phenomenon they are modeling is unfolding unseen. The normalization of scientific inquiry does not promise quick answers, but it represents a shift in attitude, a willingness to treat the unknown not as fantasy, but as data. The skies are no longer off limits to serious study. They are becoming part of the great landscape of human curiosity, alongside black holes, dark matter, and the search for life on distant worlds. And in that normalization lies a gentle hope. For the first time in generations, the boundary between mystery and science is softening, allowing the two to meet in quiet laboratories, in data archives, in whispered conversations among researchers. The questions are no longer dismissed. They are being asked carefully, cautiously, but asked nonetheless. Even as science begins to normalize the study of UAPs, another tension remains, one that has shaped the story from its very beginning: the balance between transparency and secrecy. Governments exist to protect, to secure borders and skies, to shield their people from threats seen and unseen. Yet in doing so, they often withhold information, believing silence to be safer than disclosure. The subject of unidentified phenomena has always lived at this crossroads, between the public's longing to know and the state's instinct to conceal. The Pentagon's recent steps toward openness illustrate this delicate balance. Reports have been published, hearings held, and new offices established. Yet behind every sentence released to the public lies a calculation: how much can be said without revealing too much? How far can acknowledgement go before it begins to endanger sensitive systems, national defense strategies, or even the fragile stability of public perception? For lawmakers, the balance is equally difficult. Citizens expect transparency from their representatives, especially when dealing with mysteries that touch on the shared experience of looking skyward. Yet those same citizens also expect protection from adversaries. To reveal every radar capability, every satellite observation, would be to hand tools to rivals who might use them against the nation. Thus, congressional hearings often unfold in two layers: one public, with careful phrasing, and one classified, where details are spoken more freely, but never leave the secure walls. This duality frustrates many. To some, secrecy feels like evasion, proof of cover-up. To others, transparency feels risky, exposing weaknesses in defense. The truth lies in the uneasy space between. Some information is indeed withheld to avoid embarrassment or ridicule. Other information is withheld because disclosure could reveal methods and technologies far more sensitive than the mystery itself. Sorting between the two is a task only insiders can manage, and even they often disagree. For the individuals who encounter UAPs, pilots, radar operators, intelligence analysts, the balance plays out in personal terms. To speak openly risks violating chains of command or revealing classified data. To remain silent risks burying experiences that might contribute to understanding. Many choose silence, carrying memories quietly. Others take the risk, speaking carefully, often stripped of technical detail but filled with sincerity. Their voices are both limited and powerful, fragments of a truth that cannot yet be told in full. Imagine a Pentagon office late at night, a handful of officials gathered around a table. On one side lies a classified report, filled with radar plots, speeds, and technical data. On the other lies a public version, slim and cautious, its words softened to avoid alarm. The officials debate line by line. Should this speed be included, or would it reveal too much about radar sensitivity? Should this location be named, or would it risk exposing operations? The process is painstaking, every sentence weighed between openness and restraint. The result is a paradox. The public receives glimpses, enough to confirm the reality of the phenomenon, but not enough to satisfy curiosity. Governments retain control, enough to protect methods and systems, but not enough to erase suspicion. Between the two lies a tension that may never fully resolve, and yet, this balance may also be necessary. A world of complete secrecy breeds mistrust and speculation. A world of total transparency risks vulnerability. The path forward must weave between, allowing enough openness to foster trust while preserving enough silence to ensure security. It is not a comfortable balance, but it may be the only sustainable one. For listeners tonight, this tension is part of the larger story. Disclosure is not a single act, not a sudden unveiling of truth. It is a slow negotiation, a dance between secrecy and openness, shaped by forces that pull in opposite directions. Each report, each hearing, each cautious phrase reflects this delicate balance, a reminder that in matters of mystery, the silence of power is rarely absolute, and the voice of disclosure is rarely complete. And so, as the journey continues, we remain in that space between where transparency flickers like light through a half-closed door, and secrecy lingers like shadow, protecting, withholding, and reminding us that some mysteries resist not only explanation, but also revelation. Across generations, the skies have given us both certainty and wonder. We map the stars, calculate their distances, and chart the paths of satellites with precision. We send probes to other planets, land rovers on Mars, and detect the faint signatures of worlds circling suns, hundreds of light years away. Yet even with all this knowledge, a quiet truth remains. Some things in the sky cannot yet be explained. And perhaps for humanity, that is not a flaw, but a gift. Living with mystery has always been part of the human story. Ancient civilizations looked upward and saw gods, spirits, and signs written in the heavens. Sailors charted their voyages by constellations, finding both guidance and wonder in the night sky. Farmers planted crops by lunar cycles, blending science with myth. The stars have never been merely lights above us. They have been companions, mysteries that remind us of our smallness and our longing to know. The UAP phenomena continue this tradition in a modern form. Pilots, radar operators, and ordinary people glimpse something that resists explanation. Their accounts ripple outward, becoming part of our collective memory. Governments issue reports, scientists search for answers, journalists write stories, but through it all, the central mystery remains intact. It may be frustrating at times, but it also invites reflection. To live with mystery is to accept that not everything must be solved to hold meaning. For many, the lack of definitive answers does not diminish the wonder. In fact, it may enhance it. There is comfort in knowing that even in an age of satellites and algorithms, the skies still surprise us. Mystery has a way of keeping us humble, reminding us that human understanding is a work in progress. Perhaps disclosure, in its truest sense, is not about final answers, but about acknowledging that questions remain and that asking them is part of what makes us human. The Pentagon's cautious words, "Some remain unexplained," echo more deeply than they may seem. They remind us that certainty is not always the goal. Sometimes acknowledgement is enough. To admit mystery is to allow room for curiosity, for wonder, for imagination. It is an act of humility, rare in institutions built on authority, and powerful for that very reason. Imagine lying beneath the night sky, far from city lights. The stars scatter endlessly above, some so faint they seem more like whispers than flames. Perhaps a satellite glides past, steady and predictable. Then for a moment, something else, a flash, a dart, a silent object, crossing the sky in a way that feels unlike anything familiar. You may never know what it was, and yet the memory stays, a reminder that the world still holds secrets, that wonder is still alive. Living with mystery also fosters resilience. When answers do not come easily, patience grows. When the unknown lingers, imagination expands. We learn to carry questions without demanding immediate solutions. In this way, the UAP mystery teaches us not only about the skies, but about ourselves, our capacity to dwell in uncertainty, to find peace in curiosity, and to dream even when the map is incomplete. For governments, this lesson may be harder. Institutions thrive on control, on clear definitions and solutions. But for individuals, for those who gaze upward on quiet nights, the presence of the unexplained can be a source of comfort. It tells us that the story of humanity is still unfolding, that discovery has not ended, that the universe still holds surprises, waiting to be revealed in their own time. And so the gentle road ahead may not be one of sudden revelations or final truths. It may be a road where mystery remains, not as a failure, but as a companion. The skies may never yield all their secrets, and perhaps that is as it should be. For in the silence of the unexplained, we find both humility and hope, the reminder that wonder endures, and that sometimes to live with questions is enough. The journey through the Pentagon's cautious disclosures and the voices of witnesses across decades brings us to a place not of answers, but of reflection. From Roswell's desert silence to the halls of Congress, from pilots chasing tic-tac objects over the Pacific to scientists running simulations in quiet laboratories, the mystery has stretched across generations. Tonight, as you rest, it is not the revelations themselves that linger, but the atmosphere they create, the calm acknowledgement that the skies remain vast, alive, and filled with questions that still whisper just beyond our reach. The Pentagon's language has been careful, unexplained, anomalous, unidentified, words chosen not to alarm, but to leave open the possibility of wonder. They remind us that disclosure is not a single moment of dramatic unveiling, but a process, a slow softening of silence, a gradual widening of perspective. And as the silence gives way, Even in measured tones, we find ourselves looking upward differently. We know that not every light in the sky is a satellite, not every shape a drone. Some things remain, quietly, beyond. Living with mystery, as we have seen, is not a burden but a gift. The skies hold questions, and in those questions lie humility. We are reminded that for all our science, our satellites, and our sensors, there are still phenomena that move beyond our grasp. The Pentagon admits what witnesses have long known, that some objects defy explanation, not many, perhaps, but enough to shift the narrative, enough to open the door to curiosity once more. And so, as we reach the close of this story, it is not conclusions we carry, but calm acknowledgement. The echoes of silence have given way to cautious voices. The ridicule of decades has softened into hearings and reports. Scientists are beginning to explore what was once unmentionable. Across nations, archives open, revealing decades of testimony. Together they form not an answer, but a tapestry, a reminder that mystery does not end when silence breaks. It only deepens. Picture for a moment the Pentagon at night, its 5 sides illuminated against the Washington darkness, windows glowing here and there with late workers. Within its corridors, reports are filed, words chosen, sentences balanced carefully between secrecy and openness. Outside, the Potomac drifts silently under moonlight. Beyond the river, the city sleeps, unaware of the quiet conversations unfolding inside. It is in those quiet rooms that mystery is acknowledged, not solved, not dismissed, but admitted into the record. Now imagine a pilot, years earlier, gazing upward from the cockpit of a jet. The ocean rolls endlessly beneath. The sky stretches infinitely above. Suddenly, an object appears, smooth, silent, moving with impossible grace. For a few moments, the ordinary world becomes extraordinary. Later in testimony, the pilot's voice carries that moment into history. The Pentagon catalogs it, analysts debate it, and eventually those words ripple outward into reports and hearings. Yet for the pilot, the memory is simpler, a feeling of wonder at what cannot be explained. For you, resting now, these stories are not meant to stir unease, but to remind you of the gentle vastness of the unknown, the skies above, the forests and deserts below, the oceans that stretch from horizon to horizon. All are filled with mystery. To drift into sleep while holding that thought is to enter a space of peace. The world is not fully known, and in that unknowing lies beauty. As you breathe slowly, feel how each inhale carries the weight of the day, and each exhale lets it go. Imagine yourself walking through a quiet forest at twilight, the air cool, the stars beginning to glimmer above. Between the trees, a soft light appears, not threatening, not alarming, just present, a reminder that the universe holds secrets. You pause, watch, and breathe. The light drifts upward, vanishing into the night sky, leaving behind only stillness. You continue your walk, calm and at ease, carrying the sense of wonder with you. Or picture yourself lying on a hillside beneath the open sky. Above, countless stars shimmer, some bright, some faint. Among them, one moves differently, silent, steady, gliding across the firmament in a way that feels unusual. You do not know what it is. You do not need to. The mystery is enough. The stars cradle you in their vastness, and the hillside beneath supports you in its quiet steadiness. In that moment, you are both small and infinite, a witness to wonder. The Pentagon's disclosures remind us that even the most powerful institutions do not hold all the answers, their reports, their hearings, their new offices. These are steps, not conclusions. The mystery remains, shared by all who look upward, and perhaps that is the most important truth of all, that the unknown belongs not only to governments or scientists, but to every person who pauses beneath the sky and feels the quiet tug of curiosity. As you drift deeper into rest, let the story soften into background. Let the details of hearings and reports dissolve into the broader truth that mystery endures, and that living with it brings comfort. The skies are vast, the world is full of questions, and sleep itself is a kind of mystery too. You close your eyes, you surrender to rest, and you wake hours later, renewed without ever knowing exactly how sleep carried you. Mystery, in this way, is part of life itself. So let your breathing slow, let your thoughts quiet. The Pentagon has spoken in careful words, but the stars still speak in silence. Their language is not one of conclusions, but of presence, steady, eternal, patient. As you rest, imagine those stars watching over you, companions in the night, carrying secrets not yet revealed. You do not need answers tonight. You only need wonder. You only need calm. You only need to let yourself drift, as the story closes, into dreams as wide as the sky, into dreams of infinite sky.